Chapter 138. Wu Zhu had entered the palace for the last time 5 days ago. He had confirmed that the key was hidden somewhere in Hongguang Palace, so Fan Xian had searched there first. Perhaps it had been peaceful for too long, but Hongguang Palace, where the Empress Dowager lived, was quiet and peaceful. The serving girls on night watch had all fallen asleep, and the eunuchs responsible for watching the incense burner were also drowsy. A faint fragrance wafted by. Both the eunuchs and the serving girls fell into a deep sleep. In the dim light, Fan Xian followed a relatively dark corner and slid into the bedroom. His eyes looked at the strangely luxurious bed in the distance and furrowed his brows slightly. The old woman covered by a thin silk blanket was the Empress Dowager? He didn't have time to sigh too much, nor would he express his senseless fantasies about how history could be changed in his hands. He only calmly walked forward and walked to the side of the bed. He didn't even glance at the woman on the bed, who was probably the most powerful woman in the world. Calmness was the most important quality that Wu Zhu and Fei Jie had taught Fan Xian. There was no ace hidden in the palace that Fan Xian had anticipated. In his previous plans, he had always thought that the palace would be like what Gulong had written. Beside the Emperor and Empress Dowager, there would always be hidden killers who would never see the light of day. He didn't look around Hongguang Palace to see where the treasure could be hidden. Instead, he slid directly under the Empress Dowager's bed and closed his eyes. His palms began to caress the wooden boards under the bed. The wood was excellent, but his actions were a bit strange. Not long after, he opened his eyes in the darkness under the bed. His pupils were clear, and a trace of absurd joy flashed through them. In Danzhou, he had hidden the nameless martial secret in a secret compartment under the bed. In the Deer in the Cauldron, Mao Dongzhu had also hidden the 42-chapter sutra in a secret compartment under the bed. The Empress Dowager of the Kingdom of Qing also had a secret compartment under her bed. Sometimes, the human imagination was very poor. The dagger pressed lightly and slid in from the side. The blade cut through the wood noiselessly, but the Empress Dowager turned over on the bed. The old woman mumbled something. Fan Xian's face was expressionless. It was as if he hadn't heard anything. He continued to work steadily. In a short while, he had taken down the secret compartment. He didn't dare to reach out and flip through it, but his night vision was very strong, so he easily and luckily saw what it was. There were no jewels or banknotes in the secret compartment, only a piece of white cloth, a letter, and a key. Fan Xian looked at the shape of the key and furrowed his brows slightly. A strange expression appeared on his face. He didn't take out the white cloth or the letter. He just put the key in his pocket and slid it out. A moment later, he reappeared beneath the palace walls. Climbing into the carriage, Fan Xian looked at Wang Qinian and quietly said, "What I need is speed." Yes, Wang Qinian did not know what his mission was today. He only knew that he had to pick up his master at this street corner and then meet the person he had invited back. "I don't want anyone to know that I'm in this carriage." "Don't worry, sir. This is a car borrowed from the Bureau of Military Affairs. No one will dare to stop it, and no one will know." "Very good." Fan Xian's mind relaxed a little. He leaned back in his seat and frowned. First, he had faked his drunkenness, and then he had to sneak into the palace at night. It had taken a lot out of him. The carriage arrived at a courtyard that Fan Xian was completely unfamiliar with. The two of them quietly got out of the carriage, put on their masks again, and went straight to a secret underground room. Wang Qinian said in a muffled voice, "Sir, this is a locksmith." In front of the two of them, on a small wooden table, were many metal tools that neither of them could recognize. They glowed faintly under the light. The owner of the tools was a middle-aged man who looked somewhat honest and slow. His face was a sheet of iron, but he had a simple and honest smile on his face. Locksmith was a profession, and it was also a form of address. But this middle-aged man was not called a locksmith because of his appearance. His name was a locksmith, and from this, one could see the extent of his skill. Fan Xian nodded and said to Wang Qinian, "Wait outside." Wang Qinian bowed his head and left the secret room. He knew that there were some things that he would never know, and that was the safest. This matter concerns the interests of the country. As a member of the Bureau of Military Affairs, I ask that you do something for the country, Fan Xian said calmly through his mask. The locksmith's heart trembled. He thought of the foreign envoys that had recently come to the capital, and he suddenly thought he had guessed something. He quickly bowed, unsure of what he had to do. Be fast and accurate. Fan Xian took the key from his belt. It has to be exactly the same. The locksmith took it and looked at it carefully. He frowned. There is no lock like this in the world. I don't care. I just want you to make a copy of this key. Can you do it or not? It's very difficult. This key is too complicated. Even if the shape is exactly the same and no one can detect it, I can't guarantee that the copied key will be able to open the corresponding lock. Very well, let's begin. Fan Xian was pleasantly surprised by the reply, but his voice was still cold. The locksmith nervously copied the key, and from time to time came the sound of grinding iron. Fan Xian also nervously looked at the door of the secret room. He didn't know how long Wu Zhu could stall Eunuch Hong. Eunuch Hong lived too close to Hongguang Palace. If Eunuch Hong returned to the palace, it would be difficult for Fan Xian to put the copied key back. Finally, the locksmith finished his work, sweating profusely. He handed the key to Fan Xian. Fan Xian compared the two keys and found that the copied key was exactly the same. Even the rust on it was almost identical. He finally relaxed a little. He smiled and asked, "What did you do before?" His face was covered with a black cloth, so his smile looked a bit strange. I was a thief." The locksmith was sweating profusely. He didn't know what he had to face after completing such a secretive task. Fan Xian thought to himself, so it's someone in the same line of work. He squinted at the tools and molds left on the table and frowned. He walked to the table and grunted. Tyrannical Jinshi rushed out of his body and smashed all the molds in his hands. He told Wang Qinian to destroy the metal tools as well and send the locksmith south for a while. Only then did Fan Xian relax and return to the palace. He re-entered Hongguang Palace. The sweet fragrance had faded, but the night breeze was still gentle. The atmosphere of peace and harmony filled the palace. Like a ghost, Fan Xian slid under the bed and put back the copied key. He took out the adhesive he had brought with him and rearranged the secret compartment. Only then did he quietly leave the palace. Fan Xian didn't know how long it had been since the last bell rang. He knew it was time for him to leave. But at that moment, his eyes fell on a small courtyard on the other side of the palace. It was Guangxin Palace, where the eldest princess lived. Fan Xian's plan for today had been perfect. If he didn't want to complicate things, he should have immediately left the palace and waited for things to gradually develop. Perhaps it was the joy of obtaining the key that got to his head, or for some other reason. Fan Xian's next move was somewhat unexpected. He believed that under the cover of darkness, even in a palace as strict as the palace, he would still be able to walk freely. Walking along the corridors, Wu Zhu and Fei Jie, the two masters of darkness, relied entirely on their nocturnal abilities. With great difficulty, they approached Guangxin Palace. Along the way, they even brushed past a yawning palace maid. Guangxin Palace was still lit. It was obvious that there were people inside. Guangxin Palace was different from the other palaces in the palace. There was a small wall outside the palace. As the saying goes, if you've already crossed the river, what's there to be afraid of? But Fan Xian knew that many masters eventually died at the hands of mediocre people. So he carefully circled to the back of the palace, closed his eyes, and climbed up the thick pillar. His palm fell on the smooth surface of the pillar. Fan Xian had used up too much of his Jinshi that day. He couldn't help but feel flustered and impatient, so it was a bit difficult to climb up. Carefully, he climbed to the roof of Guangxin Palace. He didn't dare to open the roof tiles to peek. Instead, he squinted his eyes and looked for the hard-to-find bright tiles among the glazed tiles. Perhaps his luck was too good. The roof of the royal palace did not need bright tiles, but the eldest princess was someone who liked daylight. So Fan Xian found one and carefully crouched down, lowering his head to ensure that each simple movement was stable and did not make any noise. Under the bright tile, the light was not bright, but with Fan Xian's eyesight, he could still see and hear clearly. He squinted, knowing that he had guessed correctly, and his luck was good. The eldest princess, Li Yunrui, reclined on the couch. Her face was languid, and she looked charming. She only wore a white robe. Under the thin silk, the curves of her body were revealed. There was a hint of youth in her maturity. If any man in the world were to see her, they would probably bow down to her bare feet. As the emperor's closest sister, she didn't need to use her beauty to seduce him. And the man in front of her was 70 years old. Before tonight, he was known as the world's foremost scholar of morality. He wasn't someone who could be seduced. Zhuang Mohan coughed twice. My business is done. I hope the eldest princess will not break the agreement. The eldest princess played with the fake scroll that she had spent a fortune to make. She smiled sweetly, filling the room with spring. In a soft and timid voice, she said, I want Master Zhuang to trample Fan Xian to the ground, so that he will no longer have the face to stay in the capital. Can you do that? Chapter 139. Zhuang Mohan smiled. By framing him today, I have staked 70 years of my reputation on the line. If I lose, I am willing to accept the consequences. What I do not understand is that Master Fan is like a celestial being in poetry. If you had told me earlier, I would not have humiliated myself. The eldest princess sighed. I did not expect that child to have such a demented temperament in addition to his reputation for poetry. Zhuang Mohan closed his eyes, a look of regret on his face. After a while, he said slowly, I'm not regretting anything else. I'm only lamenting that I have been sober for half my life. Now that I am old, I have done such an ugly thing. If Master Fan hadn't written 300 poems in one night, perhaps the people of the world would have believed that Master Fan was a shameless plagiarist because of what I said. The old man opened his eyes. They were calm and clear again. He smiled. That is fine. Fine? The eldest princess's bare feet slid gently along the edge of the couch. She bit her lip and said bitterly, Master Zhuang, Mother has always respected your talent and virtue. That is why I invited you to live in the palace. I have fulfilled my promise to you. What about your promise to me? Do you think that the agreement between the two countries has been signed and that your brother will soon be welcomed back home, that Fan Xian will be able to preserve his reputation, and that you, old fox, will feel at ease? Zhuang Mohan smiled. A mistake is a mistake. My heart belongs to my family. That is why I fell into the eldest princess's trap and came to Qing. My brother has killed countless people in the first half of his life. If the eldest princess wishes to go back on her word, there is nothing I can do. I can only pray for him after I return to Northern Qi. I hope that he will live a more comfortable life in the prison of the Overwatch Council. The eldest princess smiled. I sold Yin Bingyin to your student, the emperor. That was the only way you could bring Xiao In back to Northern Qi. This deal was not between you and me, but between your emperor and me. But I have already fulfilled my end of the bargain, and you have not done what you promised me. Tonight in the palace, if you had not pretended to spit out blood and admitted defeat, but instead insisted that Fan Xian's poem was a copy, who knows what would have happened. So, Master Zhuang, after you return, remember to send a message to your emperor's students. Northern Qi owes Guangxin Palace a favor. Zhuang Mohan smiled. Master Fan is talented, and his poetic ability is beyond the reach of ordinary people. I believe the eldest princess has also guessed that this Master Fan is a Tianmai who has not appeared in the world for a long time. I am very curious. The kingdom of Qing has a Tianmai. Why is it that they are not in a hurry to protect him? Instead, they want to get rid of him. What's more, even if he were to accuse Master Fan of plagiarism, what harm would it cause him? The eldest princess said lightly, I have never believed in the nonsense of a Tianmai being. Master Zhuang is well-read and should know what the saints say. If Fan Xian was some Tianmai person, if his ability was only in reciting poetry and such small things, what good would it do the Qing court? As for why I want to deal with him, that has nothing to do with you. Zhuang Mohan had staked decades of his life on the peerless position he held in the hearts of the world's scholars. He wanted to trample Fan Xian underfoot, and it was all because of the eldest princess. But he did not know the complicated relationships in the Qing court, nor did he know that the eldest princess and Fan Xian would become mother-in-law and son-in-law in the near future. But Fan Xian knew why the eldest princess wanted to deal with him. He half knelt on the roof of the palace. His 3 fingers on the tiles were a little cold. Looking at the charming princess in her early 30s below the bright tiles, the coldness in his eyes gradually increased. When Guobaoquan spoke in the hall, Fan Xian knew that the nobles of the palace had joined forces with Zhuang Mohan to drive him out of the capital. The matter of plagiarism seemed like a small matter, but it involved the so-called character. If he had not been talking about poetry in the hall and shocked the entire hall, perhaps everyone would have believed Zhuang Mohan's words. He had become a literary thief. Although he would not be punished, and his career could be discussed later, his marriage with Wanner might fall through. The eldest princess knew better than he did what the Empress Dowager did not like. What chilled Fan Xian even more was that the former head spy of Northern Wei, Xiao En, in a secret agreement between the two countries, was Zhuang Mohan's elder brother. In order to persuade Zhuang Mohan to come to the Qin kingdom to suppress him, the eldest princess did not hesitate to sell the head spy of the Qin kingdom stationed in northern Qi, the son of a court official, Yin Bingyun, to the enemy country. She was too daring. How could the emperor in the palace tolerate his own sister doing such a thing that harmed the country's integrity? The summer night breeze blew through the eaves of Guangxin Palace, calming the frowning Fan Xian. He knew that even if he heard these secrets, he could not use them to threaten her. She was the emperor's sister and the Empress Dowager's favorite daughter. These two identities alone were enough for her to run amok in the Qin kingdom, selling out officials for her own personal gain. Fan Xian looked at the woman's jet-black hair on the couch below and felt a wave of disgust. This woman was not only crazy, but also perverted. At this moment, Fan Xian seemed to see the whole plot clearly. The agreement between the eldest princess and the emperor of northern Qi was to sell out the head spy of the Overwatch Council, Yin Bingyun, who had been undercover in northern Qi for 4 years, in exchange for Xiao, En, and Sea Lily. The price northern Qi offered was to invite the world-famous Zhuang Mohan to the capital of the Qin kingdom and use his mouth to destroy Fan Xian. At the same time, they could use this to teach a lesson to the Overwatch Council, which had never listened to the eldest princess. However, he didn't know what else was included in the agreement between her and the emperor of northern Qi. Fan Xian guessed that by selling off the head spy of the Qin kingdom in northern Qi, the eldest princess must have obtained more than this. She must have obtained something even more terrifying. Did the emperor know what his own sister was doing? He touched the hard key at his waist, and a cold light flashed in his eyes. He thought of a way to deal with this, adjusted his breathing in the night wind, and began to retreat. The palace was too dangerous, and he did not know how long his good luck would last. Just as he stepped off the pillar, he saw 2 people slowly approaching from the end of the corridor, holding palace lanterns. Fan Xian's heart trembled, and he carefully hid his body in the shadow of the pillar. As the lanterns neared, he moved his feet subtly, keeping his body in the same area as the shadows. He secretly prayed that this serving girl would be like the one who had passed by him earlier and would not discover him. The serving girl had already walked past the pillar, and Fan Xian had already moved to the other side of the pillar. Suddenly, the palace maid stopped. This palace maid seemed to have some status in Guang Xian Palace. She whispered something to the little girl who was following her. The little girl responded sweetly and left. The middle-aged palace maid stood and waited. The distance between her and Fan Xian was only 1 wooden pillar. Fan Xian carefully adjusted his breathing with Jinqi, gradually matching the breathing of the serving girl behind the pillar. At the same time, he heard with some peace of mind that there was no change in the serving girl's breathing. It seemed that she had stopped here by coincidence and had not discovered him. The 2 of them were still separated by a wooden pillar. Suddenly, a cold light flashed in Fan Xian's eyes, which were not covered by his black mask. His entire body twisted a few inches to the left. This innate sense of danger had allowed him to escape a disaster. Where his body had originally been, the sharp tip of a sword had silently pierced through the wooden pillar. Because the wooden pillar was too big, the tip of the sword only extended a little. It was cute and full of killing intent, and it told Fan Xian that if he had not twisted earlier, the tip of the sword would have been in his waist. Fan Xian coldly circled around a long pillar, and like a mudfish, he accurately locked his hand forward and grabbed the middle-aged serving girl's left forearm. His reaction was different from that of a normal fighter, and he did not care about the other party's movement to draw the sword. The effect was very good. The serving girl's sneak attack had failed, and she was afraid that the assassin would stop her from drawing the sword, so she concentrated all her jinqi on her right arm, and the defense of her left arm was much weaker. With the sound of a piece of paper being torn apart, the serving girl drew the sword from the wooden pillar and opened her mouth to scream. Fan Xian's eyebrows relaxed, and the tyrannical jinqi in his body poured into the other party's left arm with great vigor. This palace maid had the strength of level 7, but she had never encountered the strange, genuine qi in an assassin's body. She felt a stabbing pain in her meridians, as if countless knives were scraping the tender walls of her meridians. This kind of pain made the palace maid's chest tighten, and she actually swallowed the warning sound, making a strange, soft sound in her throat. Fan Xian recognized at a glance that this serving girl was the one who had welcomed him into Guangxin Palace. Her eyebrows were extremely long, and her appearance was very special. The serving girl's eyebrows trembled, and she circulated the jinqi in her body, wanting to fight him head-on. She did not know that the hand holding her arm would suddenly lose its jinqi, and all the jinqi she had circulated around her body would fall into thin air. In a daze, she felt very uncomfortable. Because of this sudden imbalance, the right side of her body seemed to be slightly sluggish. In this split second, the right side of her neck went slightly numb, and then she immediately felt her entire body become slightly stiff. Fan Xian frowned, and his 2 fingers retracted from her neck. He knew that the poison on the needle could not truly seal the throat with blood. He immediately flipped his right palm over and pressed it against the serving girl's abdomen, where the ribs connected. With a muffled sound, the serving girl's chest caved in, and blood flowed from all her orifices. She died. Chapter 140. He didn't know if the young serving girl had gone to report, or if it was a trap set up by the serving girl who had died by his hand. But Fan Xian knew that although he hadn't let the serving girl make a sound during the fight, the true masters of the palace must have been alerted. So he didn't care about the corpse on the ground. The tip of his foot touched the stone floor, and his whole body turned into a sharp arrow, flying in the direction of the palace wall he had planned. The palace wall was still as high as ever. Fan Xian was a little annoyed at his own speed. When he finally reached the top of the wall, he heard a buzzing sound behind him, as if the air behind him had begun to tremble. He turned his head in shock and saw a general on the corner tower of the palace far away, looking at him with a bow drawn. In the night sky, an arrow flew toward his face like a soul-devouring divine object. A breath ago, the arrow was on the horizon. A breath later, the arrow was in front of him. The arrow seemed to have a ruthless spirit on it, insufferably arrogant. Fan Xian let out a wild roar. The black cloth on his face was shaken to pieces by this roar. The nameless tyrannical jinqi that he had quietly cultivated in his body for 16 years, in this moment of life and death, wildly and ruthlessly poured into his hands. His fists met in the air, and just so happened to hit the shaft of the arrow. In a moment, the violent jinqi in his fists collided with the powerful force of the arrow. The shaft of the arrow had already been smashed into powder, and the arrowhead narrowly brushed past Fan Xian's hair, piercing the night sky far away. A loud noise rang through the night sky of the palace, startling those who were sleeping and waking them up. It was like a sudden clap of thunder on the palace wall. This arrow was too powerful. It didn't seem like something a mortal could shoot. After blocking it with his fists, the jinqi in Fan Xian's body was depleted. He fell down the palace wall, dispiritedly and powerlessly. His black clothes fluttered in the night wind. He looked very wretched. Far away on the corner tower of the palace wall, Yan Xiaoyi, the commander of the royal palace, watched the assassin fall down the palace wall. Her eyes narrowed, revealing a very valiant expression. She said coldly, "He's not dead. Go catch him." "Yes." The subordinate guard received the order and left. Under the palace wall, Fan Xian, dressed in black, fell. Just as he was about to hit the ground, he forcefully twisted his body, one knee, one foot, and one hand on the ground. He crashed into the ground with a muffled thud. The powerful force made him spit out blood, wetting the remaining pieces of black cloth on his face. Immediately after, he gave a low roar and ran toward the forest outside the palace walls. In the instant before the guards at the corner of the city appeared, he disappeared into the darkness of Jingdo. The next day, in an inconspicuous small room at the foot of the imperial city, old eunuch Hong didn't seem to be in good spirits. He sat on the main seat with his eyes half closed. The two generals were also resting with their eyes closed. It seemed that no one was willing to speak. After a long time, Deputy Commander Gong Dian, who had been resting at home the night before, said softly, "His Majesty is shocked." The commander of the imperial palace, Yin Xiaoi, who had shot Fan Xian off the wall with an arrow last night, now slowly opened his eyes. He said coldly, "One of the eldest princess's personal serving girls died. The eldest princess is very angry." After the two of them spoke, Eunuch Hong slowly opened his eyes. In a slightly aged voice, he said, "Yesterday, I fell for the trap of luring the tiger away from the mountain. The Empress Dowager is very unhappy." "Who is it?" Gong Dian asked matter-of-factly. In his heart, even if it was luring the tiger away, with Eunuch Hong, a peerless ace who still had the power of a tiger even in his illness, there was no chance of escape. "I don't know." Eunuch Hong smiled slightly. The level he displayed was only above the 9th level, but he was very familiar with the buildings of Jingdo, especially in the dark. "I was led around Jingdo a whole time, but in the end, I still lost him. This person is very impressive." For Eunuch Hong to say that someone was impressive, that person must truly be impressive. Yin Xiaoi was 35 years old and was at the peak of his mental state. As the commander of the guards in the palace, he was responsible for the safety of the entire royal palace. He looked coldly at Eunuch Hong and said, "Where did you follow him to in the end?" "In an alley not far from the Dongi diplomatic mission," Gong Dian said. "The results of today's investigation are out." Eunuch Hong's chopsticks pierced through the clothes of the first assassin. After the Overwatch Council compared them, they confirmed that they came from Tianxiang satin. Yin Xiaoi closed his eyes to rest. Gong Dian continued. The Overwatch Council found out that some time ago, the Dongi diplomatic mission had ordered a batch of clothes from Tianxiang. They did not use the name of the diplomatic mission, but had someone else help them. Eunuch Hong quietly asked, "What are you trying to say, Deputy Commander?" Gong Dian smiled. Why would they use someone else's name to order clothes? Clearly, they were worried that we would catch some small trace. Looking at all the clues, the first assassin should have been someone from Dongi. The only one who could be above the 9th level is Sigu Sword's first disciple, Yun Jilan, who has been quiet in the capital these days. Yin Xiaoi suddenly opened his eyes. It wasn't Yun Jilan. If someone from Dongi wanted to sneak into the palace, why would he need to buy new clothes? He could just knock out a random person on the street and strip them. Yun Jilan is a straightforward person. Eunuch Hong nodded. Although that 9th level person hid his sword will, he still walked the path of Sigu's sword. So I'm very interested. If it wasn't Yun Jilan, could it be that someone from Dongi came and dared to disobey Yun Jilan's orders? The possibility of framing someone is very high. Gong Dian listened to the two of them and frowned. It's too much of coincidence. So it could be that someone framed Yun Jilan. How many people in Dongi could inherit Sigu Sword's legacy? Including Yun Jilan, there are 3 9th level people. Then the other 2 are suspects. Let's talk about the night traveler who was shot down by the commander. I heard that the power of the commander's arrow shook the entire palace. Unfortunately, it didn't kill him. From the tone of his voice, it seemed that Eunuch Hong and this commander did not get along very well. Yin Xiaoi looked down on this eunuch, but he knew that he was the most powerful person in the imperial palace. He snorted coldly and said, "The second assassin was also a 9th level figure. Although he was only below the 9th level, if I could kill him with one arrow, wouldn't I become one of the 4 Grandmasters? Another 9th level? Gong Dian was full of shock. He himself had been hovering above the 8th level all his life, unable to advance even an inch. When he heard that 2 9th level aces had sneaked into the palace last night, he could not help but feel many complicated emotions. There are only 7 9th level masters in the entire kingdom of Qing, and only 4 in the capital. How could there be so many 9th level masters in the world? Eunuch Hong said lightly. Clearly, he didn't believe Commander Yan's judgment. He thought that Yin Xiaoyi was trying to shirk his responsibility. Gong Dian was always afraid of this kind of situation. He quickly said, His Majesty has ordered us to close this case within 10 days. I will immediately send people from the Overwatch Council to investigate the situation in each palace. First, we must determine why they would take such a big risk to sneak into the palace. Yin Xiaoyi shook his head. I don't know why the second person did it, but the first person must have something to do with Dongi. So we must start with the Dongi diplomatic mission and find out why the clothes were ordered. It would be best if we could find out where each piece of clothing went. As they were preparing to investigate, a young eunuch suddenly rushed in and announced the emperor's decree. Last night's incident was to be investigated by Yi Zhong, the commander of the capital garrison. The palace guards were to act as usual, and no one was to announce it. After the eunuch left, the 3 palace guards in the room looked at each other. Yin Xiaoyi slowly closed his eyes. He knew that His Majesty was beginning to suspect one of them. Eunuch Hong walked out with his hands behind his back, his face calm. A few days later, the capital searched for the assassin, but found nothing. His Majesty's decree actually helped Fan Xian, the true person who entered the palace. In this plan, there were not many mistakes in any aspect, but forcing Wu Zhu to wear the new brown clothes was a bit presumptuous and gave the game away. Fan Xian secretly found out that Dongi had ordered the clothes from Tianxiang satin because the son of the master of Dongi liked the traditional style of clothes in the capital, so he ordered a batch. As for why the order had been made under a secret name, it was actually for a very simple reason. The young master of Dongi, a place where all the merchants and merchants met, actually admired the clothing of the southern barbarians of Qing. If this news got out, he would probably be cursed to death by the merchants of Dongi, who had always been very bold. Of course, Fan Xian had used this trick mainly because he didn't believe that Wu Zhu could perfectly imitate Siga Jian's sword will. If he had known earlier that Wu Zhu was so powerful, Fan Xian would certainly have used the framing trick more perfectly. But the ending was not bad. At least the palace still suspected the other 2 9th level aces of Dongi. The Overwatch Council also began to investigate the day the enemy came from the palace and where the other 2 disciples of Siga Jian were. No one would think it was Fan Xian, because on the night the enemy came from the palace, all the high-ranking officials of the capital saw him drink thousands of cups of wine and write hundreds of poems in the Great Hall. Zhuang Mohan, the master of Northern Qi, was so angry that he vomited blood and wished that his hair could turn white overnight. In the end, he was completely drunk and collapsed at the feet of His Majesty. This was the error of human thinking. Not only did they think that a drunken Fan Xian could not get out of bed, but people were used to the fact that after a person did something shocking, they could not immediately do something else. After an orgasm, it was impossible to have another orgasm. There had to be a refractory period. Chapter 141. Fan Xian lay safely and comfortably on the bed. His face was pale, and he looked like a young man with a hangover. There was a copper basin next to the bed. It was very clean, because the vomit had long since been cleaned up. Ruo had already been driven to bed by him, and another servant girl was attending to him. Fan Xian's pale face was not faked, and his vomiting was not caused by medicine. The force on Yin Xiaoyi's arrow had truly injured his internal organs. His chest felt a wave of irritation. He would probably need to rest for a few days before he could recover. Thinking of that soul-devouring arrow, Fan Xian could not help but feel afraid. If he had not exploded with Jinshi at the moment of life and death, he feared that he really would have been killed by that arrow. It was hard to imagine that the arrow still had such power from so far away. It seemed that the commander was already at the upper 9th level and could step into the pinnacle of the human world at any time. Actually, when he had used both hands to smash the arrow, Fan Xian's hands had not been as fast as the arrow, so he had only smashed into the shaft. It was very dangerous, but fortunately, there were no wounds on his hands. Otherwise, if someone had seen it, he would not know how to explain it. At the time, he had taken the risk to go to Guangxin Palace to see if he could find anything. He also didn't want the people in the palace to think of the key in Hongguang Palace, because eunuch Hong had been lured away by Wu Zhu. That was the most important thing. His fingers gently rested on his waist, slowly stroking that hard thing. His heart was filled with happiness. His luck was really good, but would his luck really be good forever? He decided that he would never hide things in the secret compartment under his bed again, and he would never go to the palace to play again. In the few days that he had been pretending to be drunk, Fan Xian's immortal performance in the palace had long since spread throughout the capital. Countless scholars and nobles had come to visit, but Fan Jian had coldly blocked them outside, saying that his son had exhausted himself that day and needed to rest. But the level of the people who came was getting higher and higher. Even the descendants of some of the founding fathers and high-ranking military officers had come. Just as Fan Jian was having a headache, Fan Xian used the mouths of people in a manner to announce a decision that everyone was puzzled and regretful. Fan Xian would no longer write poetry. Many people thought that Master Fan was just spouting nonsense and did not take it seriously. Only Prince Jing's Run and Xen, who understood Fan Xian's temperament a little, knew that this matter was probably true. But in any case, it was still in the aftermath, so they could slowly discuss it later. The summer heat in the capital had gradually disappeared, and an autumn rain slowly floated down. In reality, there were only 3 days until he entered the palace, but Fan Xian felt that these 3 days were the longest of his 2 lives. The box was under his bed, and the key was in his hand. There was no greater temptation than this, but Fan Xian still endured it for 3 days. He was like a child who stole a snack from the kitchen that his mother did not allow him to eat, and then carefully hid it in the wardrobe. Then, knowing that the snack was there, he went to sleep satisfied. Every day before he went to sleep, he glanced at the wardrobe, but he did not really want to eat it until the snack finally went bad. The box would not go bad, but Fan Xian still decided to eat it tonight. Outside the window, the autumn rain fell in a pitter-patter, landing in the backyard of Fan Manor and on the flowers and plants that were about to go through autumn frost. Fan Xian did not light a lamp inside the window. He knew that his eyes could see clearly in the dark. The box was placed on the table, and he steadily inserted the key into the brass keyhole. With a click, the plywood in front of the box sprang open, revealing a small blackboard. There were some strange little squares on the board. With a light press, the squares would sink down. Each square had a unique pattern, and no one in this world could recognize these patterns. Fan Xian smiled, but this smile was a little bitter, a little understanding, and a little consolation that had finally been confirmed after a long time of guessing. He closed his eyes and couldn't help but laugh again. He felt that this world was really too crazy. So, with trembling fingers, he lit a pot of the good local tobacco that Teng Zijing had given him to calm his mood. This was the first time he had smoked in the world of the kingdom of Qing. The smell of smoke was very good. White smoke rose in spirals in the dark room, and the autumn rain slowly fell in the lonely courtyard. Fan Xian felt that he would never be lonely again. The people of this world would not know what these little black squares were, nor would they know what the strange patterns on the squares were. But Fan Xian knew, because after the lock on the box was opened, what was revealed was a keyboard. It was a very familiar keyboard from his previous life. The strange patterns on it were actually 26 English letters, as well as the numeric keys and the F5 that Fan Xian was most familiar with. After seeing this, the matter that Fan Xian had secretly guessed for a long time had finally been confirmed. The mother of his physical body, the woman called Yi Qingmei, had come from the same place as him. At this moment, He did not think of the Tianmai being mentioned in the conversation between Zhuang Mohan and the eldest princess in Guangxin Palace. The dimly lit tobacco pot flickered in the dark room. Fan Xian's face had already recovered its calm. His hands gently placed on the keyboard, and he began to guess what the password was. It's the name. Wu Zhu, who had come to his side at some point, stood in the corner of the room. Although his eyes were covered by a black cloth, his face, facing the box, revealed an emotion that people would call sorrow. I only remember the name. The lady said there were only 5 strokes. Fan Xian nodded calmly and began to type. After all, it had been 16 years since he had come into contact with this kind of thing. At first, it felt strange, but after many tries, that familiar feeling returned to his body and his hands. His fingers danced across the keyboard. But after many tries, he suddenly smiled bitterly and raised his head. There is no name in this world that requires only 5 strokes. As soon as he said this, he knew what the problem was. He took 2 more puffs of his tobacco, looked at the box in front of him, and shook his head. He sighed. Mother, you really are messing around. But the problem is, did you teach Wu Zhu the 5 strokes before? The 5 strokes were not 5 strokes, but a 5-stroke input method. Full canned. Fan Xian entered the first name, Yi Qingmei. There was no response. He entered the 5 strokes of his own name with some uncertainty. Ibusi. There was still no response from a box. He smiled bitterly, thinking that his name had been chosen many years later. How could Yi Qingmei have known? Suddenly, he had a thought. He looked at Wu Zhu, who was in the corner of the room, with a faint smile. Wu Zhu seemed to feel his strange gaze. He tilted his head slightly. What are you doing? Fan Xian did not answer him. Instead, he entered Wu Zhu's name. GGTEDH. The box made a soft sound and then opened. Fan Xian looked at Wu Zhu again and smiled. Uncle, I now suspect that there is some indecent secret between you and Mother. Fan Xian had brought the box from Danzhou to the capital. Of course, he knew the way to the box, so he was not worried that there was a hydrogen bomb hidden inside. But when he saw the contents of the box, he could not help but shake his head as he walked out of the room and foolishly into the rainy night. He thought to himself that his mother really did not have much creativity. The box was divided into 3 layers. Due to its limited shape, the items that could be placed in each layer had to be long and narrow. The first layer had metal tools that were divided into 3 parts. Some were tubular, and some seemed to be suitable for holding. Fan Xian furrowed his brows as he looked at the metal tubes. Although he was also from Earth, he did not immediately understand what they were. It was not until he stuck his finger into one of the metal tubes that he began to understand. He raised a part of it to his eyes and looked at it carefully. He found that there was a line of letters, M82A1. Mother, father. Fan Xian's finger trembled slightly. Although he was not a military enthusiast in his previous life, he knew what this line of letters represented. This was a sniper rifle. This was the best sniper rifle in that world. If it was equipped with armor-piercing bullets, it could pierce through a thick wall from a kilometer away. Fan Xian's right hand grabbed the barrel of the gun. His hand could not help but tremble. He understood that in a society like the Kingdom of Qing, which was still in the age of cold weapons, if he had a sniper rifle in his hand, it would mean something. It meant that from now on, he would have the ability to kill anyone from a few kilometers away without fear of being discovered. It meant that regardless of whether it was the commander who had shocked the heavens with his arrow or Yun Zhilan from the Dongi diplomatic mission, as long as he wanted to, he could kill them countless times over. But he did not know if it would be effective against the Grandmaster. Fan Xian nervously placed the 3 parts of the sniper rifle on the table. He had long since put the smoking pot to one side. He placed both hands on the table and took a few deep breaths to calm himself down. It seemed that he already had all the necessary requirements to become a demon of the night. Of course, the prerequisite was that he had bullets. Fan Xian looked at the second layer, dumbfounded. Aside from a letter, there was nothing else. There were no more than 10 bullets, as he had expected. Without bullets, this sniper rifle was no better than a fire stick. Chapter 142. Where are the bullets? Xian was like a girl who woke up from a sweet dream to find herself sleeping on the firewood in the kitchen. He lowered his voice and asked Wu Zhu angrily. Wu Zhu's answer was honest, but it sounded clever to others. What are bullets? Xian was annoyed. He could only describe to Wu Zhu the shape of a bullet, its size, length, and how to use it. Full of anticipation, he asked, "Did you see my mother use this thing before?" Wu Zhu shook his head. "I told you I forgot some things." Just as Xian was feeling slightly disappointed, Wu Zhu suddenly opened his mouth and said, "However, I remember that the things you mentioned seemed to have no use back then, so when I carried you away, I threw them all in the cellar of Taiping Courtyard." Xian's temperament had long been trained to be very calm, but hearing this, he couldn't help but want to hug this cute blind man and give him a big kiss. There was a letter in the second compartment of the box. The box was well sealed, so when Xian lightly flicked the letter, no dust fell. To Wu Zhu, Xian didn't know what to feel. So this box wasn't for him, but for the person next to him. He forced a smile and handed the letter to Wu Zhu, as if forgetting that he was blind. Wu Zhu didn't take it. "The lady let me see it," he said coldly, "for you to hear. Just read it." Xian smiled, tore open the letter, and began to read. After reading a few lines, he couldn't help but smile. He had thought that the box contained the will of the divine weapon. It was a very uncreative thing, and he couldn't help but look down on his mother's methods. But after reading this letter, he realized that the woman called Yi Qingmei really did look down on all the men in the world. The handwriting wasn't elegant, and it was much worse than Roro's. It even seemed a little rough and sloppy, and the tone of the letter was also very strange. Moreover, the words inside didn't connect. It seemed that they hadn't been written at the same time. "Cute little Zhu, give me a kiss. I really like you. I wanted to introduce you to a wife many times, but you've always been cold. Be gentle. I'm really angry. If you go to that temple to fight, I guess you still won't be able to win and will have to run back like a dog. So I wrote something to make fun of you." Seeing this, Xian couldn't help but glance at Wu Zhu. How could such a handsome grandmaster look like a dog? The letter continued, "What about me? When you left, I drugged someone with an aphrodisiac and succeeded in borrowing his seed. I just don't know if it will be a precious daughter or a bastard son. This box is the only thing I've left in this world." Old Mao said that in this life, he had only affected the area around Beijing. Remember, I also said that when I came to this world, I only left behind this box. Seeing the words borrow seed and bastard of son, Xian almost fell off the stool. It turned out that not only was his life strange, but it was also quite romantic. It was a pity that the letter did not clearly state who he had borrowed the seed from. This was the biggest question in Xian's heart. The following were the original words of Xian's mother, Yi Qingmei, who had once shocked the world. "It's sad, isn't it? Other than you, there's probably no one else in this world who can open this box. Who told me to be so gentle and kind as to teach you the 5 strokes that are useless in this world? Cute little Zhu doll, I really want to hug you to sleep. Come back quickly. I put the box back in its old place. You should know where it is. Hey, if you open the box and see this letter, then of course you know where it is. I seem to have said some nonsense again. I'm just curious now. Will I have a daughter or a son? If it's a daughter, that's good. If it's a son, it'll be his father's turn to worry. And men are too ambitious. Who knows what they'll do? Okay. I admit that I'm ambitious, but want to make this world a better place. Should this little girl's beautiful wish be described as ambition? Why do I feel like I'm writing my last words? Damn it. Baba, that's too unlucky. Who knows? Let's just say it's my last words. I've already written it down. Remember, don't use this broken spear. There's no strength in chopping ants with a broadsword. After reading this letter, destroy this box. Don't let those random people in this world know of my glorious life. They don't deserve it. I've been here, seen it, played it. I've been the richest man. I've killed princes. I've plucked the beard of an old emperor. I've used the sunshine of this world to shine. I've almost unified the world, but I just don't care. How about it? My precious daughter and bastard son. I don't think they can do as much as I can. Just live on in peace. Sigh, when I die of old age, Will I be able to return to that world? Father, mother, I miss you very much. Little Juju, you don't understand what I'm saying. You don't know where I came from. I'm very lonely. People come and go in this world, but I'm still lonely. I'm very lonely. I'm very lonely. After reading the letter, Fan Xian was silent for a long time. Then he smiled and asked softly, I'm not from this world. Do you remember? Wu Zhu opened his mouth slowly. I think I remember a little. Mother said that you went to fight with the people of the temple. Did that fight make you lose part of your memory? Fan Xian's hand slowly slid along the edge of the box. I think so. If you didn't lose that part of your memory, you should be the one to open this box. After you open it, will you tell me everything? I don't think so. Fan Xian nodded. I thought so too. Maybe you'll find a small mountain village that no one knows about and grow up with me. A smile appeared on his face. Maybe that's not a bad life. He then sighed and shook his head helplessly. It's a pity that you can't start over. Why aren't you curious that I can open this box? Fan Xian teased Wu Zhu. He wanted to see the shocked expression on Wu Zhu's face when he found out that he was also a soul from another world. Why should I be curious? Wu Zhu was still very calm. He suddenly felt that the young master was just like the young lady. They were both very long-winded and boring humans. Fan Xian felt like an idiot. Does her death have anything to do with the temple? He asked. I don't know. Fan Xian was silent for a while, then continued to look at the box. There was a piece of paper stuck to the last layer of the box. He measured the difference in height between the inside and the outside. This layer should be very thin. He peeled off the paper and looked at it. He was stunned. On the paper was written, Hey, if it was Wu Zhu, after seeing that letter, you should immediately destroy this box. You actually want to keep looking. Tell me the truth. Who are you? How did you open this box? His mother really was a person with a heart of crystal. Fan Xian was lost for a moment. He replied in a daze, I am your son. Of course, she couldn't hear this answer. The paper was very short. There weren't many words on it. At the end, there was only a warning. If it's not my daughter, then it's my son. You can look at what's below when you've killed someone. Remember, looking at the exaggerated exclamation mark and the empty circle below it, Fan Xian didn't dare disobey his mother's last words. He obediently stuck the paper back on the box. I'm going out for a walk. Fan Xian said this to Wu Zhu, then left the room. With his head down, he walked into the early autumn rain. The box was with Wu Zhu, so it couldn't be safer. He wasn't worried. After Fan Xian's somewhat dispirited silhouette disappeared into the rain, Wu Zhu slowly walked out from the corner and sat down at the table. His fingers stroked the box and the gun on the table, then fell on the letter. His fingers lightly moved back and forth on the envelope. It was unclear what he was thinking. A slight rustling sound rang out between his fingers and the letter. The rustling sound rang out between the rain and the grass in the courtyard. The room was pitch black. Wu Zhu sat alone next to a box. The black cloth on his face softened, and a very gentle expression appeared on his face. Fan Xian walked alone on the street in the rainy night, letting the rain wash over his face and soak his body. A glimmer of a smile occasionally appeared on his face. In the blink of an eye, it turned into a faint sorrow. A moment later, it was calm again. Who knew how many emotions were fermenting in his heart, interweaving and colliding? Yi Qingmei, that dazzling name, seemed to have only truly entered his life and entered his mind today. He now understood many things. He knew where his mother came from and what she had done in this world. His grandmother in Danzhou had said that before his father ascended the throne, the two princes were the most likely to inherit the throne of the Qing kingdom. The two princes, on the other hand, died in a ridiculous murder case. After reading the letter, Fan Xian naturally knew that the two princes, who were always on guard against assassinations, had died under his mother's sniper rifle. In other words, the present royal family of the Qing kingdom was completely dependent on his mother to be able to have this world. His mother had built Qingyu Hall and established the Overwatch Council. She had provided the most basic of everything for the country to become powerful. It could even be said that without Yi Qingmei, there would be no present Qing kingdom. Chapter 143. Fan Xian walked on the street without feeling anything. The rain soaked into his clothes, making them cold and wet, but his heart was still burning. He looked at the streets of Jingdo again. The four-wheeled carriages walking on the streets, the glass windows of the rich families by the street, the kaleidoscopes he had seen before, and the slippery soaps, all of these things connected with him in an instant. It was as if all of these things were imprinted with his mother's aura. This street, this house, this world, everywhere had the scent of that woman. At the end of the letter, it said, "I am very lonely." Before today, Fan Xian had also been very lonely. From now on, he was no longer lonely. He laughed loudly in the rainy street. His laughter traveled far and woke up some of the pedestrians who had already taken advantage of the rainy night to sleep early. Someone cursed at him. He continued to smile. Yi Qingmei was definitely not the little girl she appeared to be in the letter. Fan Xian was certain of this. His mother had an incomparably strong heart. Only in this way could she have such a brilliant life in this completely unfamiliar world, borrowing the unfamiliar sunlight. In this familiar yet unfamiliar Qing kingdom, you have let down that woman called Yi Qingmei. The rain hit Fan Xian's face forcefully. Like a monster, he gradually became one with the pitch-black night. Perhaps this chest did not have any fundamental help to his life, but it gave him a feeling that he was not alone. It allowed him to walk more and more freely in this world and this rainy night. Fan Xian walked alone in the wind and rain, but he smiled. Since he was going to live a full life, he had to live it naturally. Just like he had said to his sister in the beginning, when they looked back on the past, don't always feel that the word sullen was written on your face. The autumn wind and rain worried people to death. Worry killed. The matter of entering the royal palace at night could not just end like this. The commander of the Jingdo garrison, Sir Yi Zhong, who had never formally appeared on the stage, began to investigate this matter after receiving the emperor's orders. Although his official position was the Jingdo garrison, in recent years, he had been leading Dingzhou to the west to protect Jingdo from afar. By the time he rushed back to Jingdo, 3 days had already passed. The discerning people in the palace knew why the emperor had chosen him. First, it was because the Yi family had received the emperor's favor and was loyal. The degree to which they were trusted by the emperor was only below that of Chen Pingping. As for Lord Chen Pingping, he naturally couldn't drag his crippled body to investigate such a trivial matter. Secondly, it was because the top 3 figures in the imperial guard system seemed to be under suspicion. Yi Zhong also knew that this matter was very complicated. The commander of the imperial guards, Yan Xiaoi, was discovered by the eldest princess many years ago. His martial prowess was known to be the best in the palace. The deputy commander, Gong Dian, was his junior disciple. As for that eunuch Hong, who never showed himself, forget it. Even Yi Zhong did not want to provoke him. Besides, Yi Chong did not suspect any of them. He was only curious about the second person who infiltrated the royal palace, and why he would kill the eldest princess personal made outside Guangxing Palace. The investigation was carried out in secret. Because the Overwatch Council had been exposed by the head spy of Northern Qi, which had angered His Majesty, they were powerless to cooperate, so it was difficult to make any substantial progress. Until one day, after carefully investigating a few palaces, Yi Zhong came to Hongguang Palace. Then he smelled a faint, strange fragrance and immediately thought of the old poison that had followed His Majesty in the army tent during the northern expedition. He then thought of what the guards had said. When the assassins attacked that night, Zhuang Mohan of Northern Qi was also in Guangxing Palace. Yi Zhong, who understood the cruelty of the palace struggles, thought of the matter in a very strange way. So he immediately entered the palace to ask for His Majesty's forgiveness and resignation. He prostrated himself on the ground, his face full of shame. Is it that you can't find out, or that you don't dare to investigate? His Majesty's face always had that smile that seemed to see through everything. The true officials would occasionally wonder if this was some kind of method to control his subordinates. But Yi Zhong knew the wisdom of the emperor he served, so he answered honestly, "I can't find out, and I don't dare to investigate. It is not convenient for me to investigate the affairs of the royal family." "Minister Yi, Are you not afraid that I will reprimand you for being disloyal to your master, for failing to distinguish between public and private affairs, and for not cherishing your life?" Yizhong did not dare to get up. He replied, "I dare not guess your majesty's intentions, but I am slow-witted and do not know where to start investigating. There is no need to investigate this matter. I know what I am doing." His majesty's smile was a little cold, but Yizhong did not see it clearly from his kneeling position. On the other side, the real suspect, Fan Xian, was still hiding in his manner these days. The main reason was that after he became famous for his poems, going to Taichung Temple to drink tea, or going to Honglu Temple to watch from the sidelines had become a luxury. The negotiations were over, and Northern Qi's diplomatic mission had already left the capital, but Dong Yi was still delayed for some time. When the news had truly died down, the Dong Yi diplomatic mission left the capital with a lot of silver, somewhat unhappily. They did not know that the fact that the kingdom of Qing did not imprison them all after the night raid on the palace was already the result of His Majesty's magnanimity. Now, Fan Xian could truly be said to have shaken the capital. No one paid attention to the power behind him, but focused on him personally. After all, in this world, he was the only one who could make the great Zhuang Mohan vomit blood on the spot. Furthermore, he was so young. As if it had been discussed beforehand, the crown prince and the second prince increased their efforts to draw him to their side. Li Hongcheng often brought Rojia to the manor for tea, and Xan Shaoqing also used the excuse of not seeing him for a long time to visit. But Fan Xian had many things to do, so for the time being, he pushed both sides away. In the banquet plan, he had only completed 2 parts. The first was to successfully find the key, and the second was to almost successfully frame Dong Yi's Yun Jilan, causing the court to increase their surveillance. This 9th-level ace was so badly battered that he could not even think of challenging Fan Xian to a duel until he left the capital, in order to ensure his own safety. He had found out that the eldest princess was colluding with Northern Qi, but he had been waiting for the right time to throw it into the pot. 2 days after the Dong Yi diplomatic mission left the capital, Fan Xian knew that the time had come. Fan Xian could not use the secret agreement between the eldest princess and the young emperor of Northern Qi to beat someone up, because there was no documentary evidence or witnesses. Fan Xian also did not dare to meet with the emperor, although with his current reputation in the capital, it would not be difficult to meet with the emperor. But he had a very complicated conjecture about the emperor, and he could not guarantee that the emperor, in order to protect the royal family's reputation, would not kill him after finding out about the eldest princess's scandal. If it had been a normal citizen of the kingdom of Qing, after encountering such a situation, they could only hide the secret forever in their hearts, not daring to tell anyone for the rest of their lives, until they vomited blood and died. But not Fan Xian. He had the memories of 2 lives and the knowledge of 2 lives. He knew the importance of public opinion and its destructive power. He also knew that to deal with the crazy eldest princess, he had to use even crazier methods. After the banquet, Shishan Paper Workshop, which had a monopoly on the paper industry in the capital and the related industries of the palace treasury, still occasionally touched the business of Dombo Bookstore. But the eldest princess had no way to command the 8th Bureau of the Overwatch Council, so she only did small things. And Fan Xian knew that this was the calm before the storm, and he decided to act first before the storm arrived. That night, Wu Zhu stood in a corner, listening to him speak. Ever since he had opened the chest, Wu Zhu had come to Fan Manor more often. It seemed that he was more worried about Fan Xian's safety. Fan Xian thought as he spoke, "If you don't want to leave any traces, then you have to rob everything." Wu Zhu tilted his body to show that he understood. Fan Xian continued, "These days, the ones who have been suppressing the business of Dombo Bookstore are the Shishan Paper Workshop and Wansong Hall of the Palace Treasury. So we have to rob the Palace Treasury's paper and then use Wansong Hall's ink. But, Uncle, has anyone in this world ever seen the words you write?" Wu Zhu said coldly, "Don't worry." Fan Xian knew that his seemingly useless and absurd plan would certainly work. He smiled. Things like flyers don't need to be too big. He used his hands to measure the size. The key is to have a lot of copies. We have to put them up everywhere, especially in places like the Imperial College and the Imperial Library. We have to put up a few more copies. The students are young and hot-blooded and are the easiest to provoke. And the scholars in the Imperial Library also like to play with their strength of character. After seeing the flyers, I think they'll be so angry they'll pull out their beards. Wu Zhu said coldly, the content. Fan Xian raised his eyebrows and sighed. I really am like an underground member of the party. He began to recite in detail how the flyers should be provocative. He had to give details that seemed both true and false, such as how the eldest princess had spoken to Zhuang Mohan, how Yin Binyun had suffered in hiding in northern Qi, how he had been mercilessly abandoned by the nobles in the palace, how the eldest princess had harmed the interests of the court in order to seek her own interests, what benefits she had obtained, how many fake eunuchs she kept in the palace, how many old lovers she had outside. Wu Zhu calmly analyzed. No one would believe that the eldest princess would sacrifice so much just for some monetary gain. Fan Xian raised his eyebrows again. There aren't many people as smart as you in the world. As long as the people believe it, it's fine. As for the emperor, let's give him a reminder. Wu Zhu said coldly, the emperor doesn't need you to remind him. Chapter 144. Fan Xian smiled. If the eldest princess, who lived in the palace, was in contact with northern Qi, and the emperor, who had countless spies under his command, knew nothing about it, it would be inexcusable. He sighed. So I don't understand. Why did he let the eldest princess live in the palace and not go to his fief? The eldest princess is the Empress Dowager's most beloved daughter. She is his sister, and he has nothing to fear. How do you think the emperor will react after this? Fan Xian trusted Wu Zhu's analytical skills. Immediately mobilize the Overwatch Council to eliminate the influence you have single-handedly created. Reward the eldest princess generously to prove the unity of the royal family. After things have calmed down, find a suitable opportunity to have the eldest princess return to her fief, Xinyang. Wu Zhu said coldly. When rewarding the eldest princess, he will probably reward Princess Chun, and, at the same time, promote you. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. He knew that Wu Zhu was describing the possible truth, but it sounded like a cold joke. Why didn't the emperor think of using my simple method to force the eldest princess out of the palace? If what you say is true, he already knew about the eldest princess collusion with northern Qi. First of all, your method is perverted. Second, he doesn't need to force his own sister out of the palace. He likes to wait for those who are hiding below the surface to surface and then capture them all in one fell swoop. He is used to doing this sort of thing. Fan Xian could tell that Wu Zhu had great faith in the emperor's abilities. His brows furrowed even tighter. Although the royal family were all heartless bastards, when comparing the two, the emperor, whom he had met twice, was clearly gentler to him than the eldest princess. Thus, Fan Xian unconsciously began to worry about the rebellion that could happen in a few years. So by doing this, will we be able to alleviate the situation in the palace? The eldest princess should still have companions in the palace. I will investigate, Wu Zhu said coldly. Fan Xian thought for a moment, then decided to proceed with the plan. He smiled bitterly. I must find a way to get the eldest princess away from the palace for a while. Otherwise, before the emperor can capture them all in one fell swoop, I will become a ghost under their hands. The emperor has the courage and strength to wait for them to make the first move, but we do not. If a power that dared to collude with a foreign country fell into some kind of fanatical mood to deal with Fan Xian could only run behind Wu Zhu. Although traveling the world was Fan Xian's wish, he was not willing to pay the price at the moment. I'm going. Go. Fan Xian waved his right arm, feeling that he really did have the air of a young student leader. In his previous life, he had seen many films about the war of resistance against Japan. He felt that the kingdom of Qing, in the darkness of night, was very much like Beiping, which had been occupied by the Japanese. He and Wu Zhu were the brave students who fought against the invaders, carefully distributing leaflets in the darkness, calling on the people of the kingdom of Qing to rise up against their shameless rulers. He smiled and lay back on the bed. The box was just sitting there under the bed. He was not worried at all. After Wu Zhu lost his memory in this aspect, he was the only one in this world who knew how to open a box. After falling into a deep sleep, he had an incomparably sweet dream. In the early autumn, there was a great snowfall in the capital. The eldest princess shyly boarded the carriage and resentfully turned her head to look at the imperial city before leaving the world she lived in. In the beginning of autumn, in September, there really was a heavy snowfall in Jingdou. The white flyers that filled the sky were like snowflakes, falling everywhere in Jingdou, especially near the Imperial College and the Imperial Library. At that time, the sky was just beginning to brighten. The students and commoners who had just woken up in the morning picked up these unfamiliar pieces of paper. This was the first time in the land of the kingdom of Qing that a flyer battle had occurred. But Fan Xian had still overestimated the passion of the people of the kingdom of Qing and underestimated the ability of the Overwatch Council and the 6 ministries to control the situation. In just 4 hours, all of the flyers in the capital had been collected into the Fangyamen by Tian'er Road. Not a single person dared to leave a flyer behind. Although the commoners rarely had any dealings with the Overwatch Council, they were afraid of the council's fierce reputation, and no one was willing to gamble with their lives. The Imperial College reacted quickly. That day, they requested an edict to begin the autumn examinations early. Within half a day, all sorts of measures were taken, and the situation was finally under control. But rumors did not need wings to fly, nor did they need air to breathe. They had long since spread through the streets and alleys of Jingdou. When people went out, they would often look at each other. The look in their eyes no longer said, "Have you eaten?" but rather, "Have you seen it?" The reputation of the eldest princess in the capital of the kingdom of Qing had never been good. After all, she was in her 30s and still unmarried. This in itself was quite strange. So although the commoners did not completely believe the accusations on the flyer about the eldest princess' illicit relations with a foreign country, they still thought it was groundless and not without reason. The logic of the neighbors and aunties was even simpler. If she was so old and still unmarried, she was definitely not a good woman. This was the first time the royal family of the kingdom of Qing had faced such a situation, and they could not help but feel nervous. Although the Overwatch Council's measures were effective, the palace was still in a state of panic. The palace maids and eunuchs deliberately lowered their voices as they walked. It was said that the emperor had lost his temper in the royal study, and the Empress Dowager had gone to Guangxin Palace. After a few slaps, the eldest princess had cried for a long time. Inside the Overwatch Council's room, there was an awkward silence. The heads of the 8 bureaus were all looking up. Qin Pingping sat in his wheelchair, pulling at the few strands of beard on his chin. He looked at the flyer and laughed strangely. Sir Qin could laugh, but the heads below him did not dare to laugh. Everyone knew what was written on that flyer. Tell me, how much of what is written on this paper is true? Qin Pingping finally suppressed the joy in his heart and looked at his subordinates. The first to bear the brunt was, of course, the head of the 8th Bureau. All of the literary products in the capital were now under the control of him and the related departments of the Ministry of Education. Such a big event had happened in the capital today, and he had long been scared out of his wits. Without answering the director's question, he rushed to report first. The paper is from Shishan Paper Workshop, which is under the control of the palace treasury. The ink is from Wansong Hall. That family has no background. Qin Pingping frowned and looked at him. I only asked if it was true, he reprimanded. I didn't ask you who wrote it. The head of the 8th Bureau wiped the sweat from his forehead and carefully replied, slandering the princess, talking nonsense about national affairs, and stirring up trouble. Naturally, none of it is true. Qin Pingping smiled, but it was a cold smile. The window was still blocked by the black cloth, so the part of his wheelchair looked cold. Is it all fake? The flyer said that the eldest princess had a secret agreement with Northern Qi to hand over Yin Bingyun, the head spy of the Qing kingdom in Northern Qi, to them. Yin Ruahai, the head of the 4th Bureau, frowned. The matter of Yin Bingyun must have been leaked by someone in the court, and it must be of a very high rank. But if it was the eldest princess, I really do not understand how this would benefit her. This flyer says that a few nights ago, Zhuang Mohan and the eldest princess met privately in Guangxin Palace, Qin Pingping said, feigning carelessness. Yin Ruohai shook his head. Master Zhuang was invited to live in the palace by the Empress Dowager. This cannot be used as evidence. Qin Pingping looked at him with admiration. Bingyun was imprisoned in the north, and yet you can still calmly analyze the situation. Not bad, he suddenly said in a low voice, but if there is a target to be suspected, then we should be suspicious. Do not forget, I am only loyal to His Majesty and the royal family, not to anyone else in the royal family. His eyes calmly looked at the person sitting in the back. That person was the head of the first bureau of the Overwatch Council, Zhuge. He was in charge of monitoring the officials in the court, and was the most powerful person in the 8th Bureau of the Overwatch Council. Zhuge nodded and frowned. There are only 5 people in total who know about the matter of Yin Bingyun, including me and Chief Yin. If the eldest princess is related to this matter, then where did she get the information? Qin Pingping continued to look at him quietly. The other 7 high officials in the room gradually felt the strange atmosphere solidify. After a long silence, Zhuge remained calm, occasionally frowning. It seemed that if what was written on the paper was true, then where did the eldest princess get the information? But the head of the 8th Bureau, sitting next to him, clearly saw a drop of sweat trickle down from his temple. Qin Pingping continued to look at him calmly. Zhuge frowned and suddenly said, "Sir, why do you suspect me?" Finally, when he opened his mouth, Qin Pingping slowly closed his eyes and said lightly, "Because you are very stupid. Why can't it be Yin Ruohai?" Examples of people selling their children for glory are not uncommon in this world. From the day Zhuge learned that Yin Bingyun had been captured, he knew that something was going to happen to him. He laughed bitterly and looked at Yin Ruohai. "You are the head of the first bureau, and Fei Jie is old. If I step back, it should be you who takes over the council." Qin Pingping closed his eyes and said calmly, "Unfortunately, you know that I have other plans, so you are not satisfied. They allowed you the power of the Overwatch Council in the future. According to the Emperor's intentions, this interesting matter could still be watched for a while, but I did not think that this morning's snowflakes would tear open everything ahead of time." Qin Pingping lightly said, "So the council can only deal with it ahead of time. Thank you, sir, for your help." Zhuge knew that if the Emperor personally dealt with this matter, what awaited him would certainly be even more tragic. His throat gurgled, and he breathed heavily with some difficulty. Chapter 145. Qin Pingping looked at him without a trace of pity. "You have followed me for 12 years. Before you die, I will give you a chance to say one last thing." The head of the first bureau paled slightly, but quickly recovered his calm smile. Looking at the man who had promoted him from an ordinary worker to the 3rd most important person in the Overwatch Council, he said sincerely, "Do not trust women. They are all crazy, and they are not suited for politics." Having said this, he slapped the top of his head. With a crack, his body went limp, and he collapsed onto the wooden table, no longer breathing. These were his heartfelt words. Even if the conversation between the eldest princess and Zhuang Mohan had not been overheard by Fan Xian, Qin Pingping's expression showed that the eldest princess had long been the focus of the council's attention. From the moment the eldest princess madly betrayed Yin Bingyun, Zhuge, the head of the first bureau, was destined to die. The corpse was dragged out. Naturally, there were rules to deal with the aftermath. Qin Pingping looked at the paper in front of him again and shook his head. Continue the analysis. Who would be so crazy as to reveal everything? He could be as calm as an ancient well, but when the other 7 heads saw a colleague they had worked with for more than a decade meet such a tragic end, they could not help but feel a little emotional. After a moment, they recovered and said the Dongyi diplomatic mission was the last to leave the day before yesterday, and today this happened. I think Dongyi has something to do with it. That's right. According to the results of the palace's investigation, The assassin who entered the palace on the night His Majesty invited the envoys of both countries to a banquet must have something to do with Dongyi. It was also that night that the assassin appeared in Guangxin Palace and killed one of the eldest princess serving girls. It was probably at that time that he overheard the conversation between the eldest princess and Zhuang Mohan. The reason Dongyi is releasing this information now is that they hope the court will be thrown into chaos for a while. After all, this time, the two countries did not reach an agreement with Northern Qi, so Dongyi is afraid that the court will send out troops. And if this matter is exposed, His Majesty will be shocked, and the agreement with Northern Qi will probably be torn apart. The two countries will go to war again, and Dongyi, who has always been caught between the cracks, will probably be happy to see that happen. Regardless of whether it is in terms of motive or final effect, Dongyi is the most likely to act. It is also the target that could benefit the most from this matter. The only question is, how could Dongyi write so many copies in one night for the papers that the Shishan Paper Workshop just lost last night? You have to know that most of their people hidden in the capital are being monitored by us. There shouldn't be that many people who are not under our control. Yin Ruohai analyzed. To do this in one night, they would need at least 40 well-trained people. Chun Pingping listened to his subordinate's methodical analysis and smiled without saying anything. The room suddenly became quiet. After a while, someone suddenly asked, "What about the exchange agreement?" "Continue," Chun Pingping said calmly. "In order to capture Xiao En, you destroyed a pair of legs. Now, because the eldest princess sold them out, you want Xiao En to be released. I cannot accept this." "Unwilling? Do you have any way to bring Yin Bingyan back alive?" Chun Pingping laughed coldly. "The exchange must be made. We will deliver Xiao En alive into the hands of Northern Qi, but we can only let him see the sky of Northern Qi Shangjing." Everyone knew that the director had a plan. They nodded slightly. No matter what, these people did not want Xiao En to be returned to Northern Qi. That old man had been the head spy of Northern Wei, and who knew how many Qing spies he had killed. Furthermore, the information in his mind, even to this day, posed a great threat to the kingdom of Qing. If it weren't for the fact that the person captured by Northern Qi was the son of the 4th Bureau's Yin Ruohai, these ruthless spies of the kingdom of Qing would certainly have written to the director to persuade His Majesty to let the unfortunate man captured by Northern Qi sacrifice himself for the country. Yin Ruohai also knew this, and so he was extremely grateful to the director. Suddenly, he asked, "What about the eldest princess? We are loyal to His Majesty. We do not know what His Majesty has not said. We will not do it." Chun Pingping made his final decision. Should we capture the Dongyi diplomatic mission? What for? Admit that the royal court has lost face? Let the 8th Bureau handle this matter. Say that the remnants of Guyu in the south, unwilling to accept the fall of their country, spread rumors in the capital. They have all been captured. Take a few of them from prison and kill them in the market. Before you kill them, make sure that all the people of the capital come to see the spectacle," Chun Pingping said lightly. The subordinates took their orders and left, disinfecting, spreading rumors, and arresting people. Only Yin Ruohai stayed until the end. He looked at the director and said calmly, "There is no poison in this world that can keep Xiao En alive and then kill him in front of the emperor of Northern Qi." "What do you mean?" Chun Pingping asked. Yin Ruohai frowned. "I know my son. He would not agree with His Majesty's methods. I think he would be happy to exchange Xiao En's life." Chun Pingping looked at him coldly. "You must avoid arousing suspicion. Do not participate in the discussion. As for what to do, that is my business." Indeed, there is no poison in this world that can be so miraculous. Even Elder Fei, who is currently in the capital, cannot do it. But Xiaoan must die, and Yin Bingyan must return. He smiled. "Do not forget, 4.5 years ago, I was the one who kicked your son to the north." Yin Ruohai was about to say something, but Chun Pingping stopped him with a wave of his hand. "I had originally planned to wait for Bingyan to return and then have him take Zhu Ji's place. Zhu Gu could have lived a few more days. But today, these pieces of paper are flying everywhere, and the capital is abuzz with discussion. I must give you an explanation. Chen Pingping sighed. What was hidden in the shadows suddenly became known to everyone in the capital. Such an absurd and effective method will probably force His Majesty to give an explanation to the officials who know of this matter. Chen Pingping coughed. You should know that there is a commissioner in the council. I told you last time that I am preparing to send him to Northern Qi. Yin Ruohai frowned. It is very dangerous. He understood that the director wanted to give the task of killing Xiao In to the commissioner. If you don't think, you won't amount to anything. Chen Pingping's eyes seemed a little tired. If he succeeds, I hope that one day in the future, you will be able to help him take care of this council. Yin Ruohai finally understood. He was slightly shocked and didn't dare to say anything more. He knelt in front of Chen Pingping's wheelchair and nodded. Who did it? Chen Pingping pushed his wheelchair to the window. His skinny fingers slowly lifted a corner of the black cloth, and like a child, he poked his head out the window. The autumn rain, which had lasted for several days, had stopped yesterday. Outside, it was a bright sunny day, and, in the distance, the palace shone with golden light. Half leaning on the wheelchair, he looked at the piece of paper in his hand with the help of the light from the corner of the black cloth. He couldn't help but shake his head. It's fine to say that she colluded with Northern Qi, but why did you have to say that she kept 3,000 men, and that she was promiscuous in the palace? This matter involved the reputation of the royal family, and it was naturally inconvenient to discuss it in the previous meeting. Chen Pingping looked at the words on the paper, which were as neat as matchsticks, and laughed. What nonsense! These words are a bit too ugly, but the handwriting and the style are really like that idiot from Dongyi City. Dongyi City, is it really you? He said to himself in his heart, and a trace of a smile rose to his face. Siga Jianbak then was just an idiot, not this kind of lunatic. To deal with that crazy girl, the eldest princess, this method is quite effective. Who cares what kind of jade or porcelain it is? Just smash it and put in a pile, and no one can tell it apart. But you have disrupted His Majesty's rules, and His Majesty will not be happy. Whether it was the meticulous Chen Pingping or the sinister and crazy eldest princess, none of them could have imagined that such a big matter had been caused by a pair of master and servant. Fan Xian calmly, even coldly, watched the aftermath of this matter. It seemed that the erotic literature he had dictated was indeed an unbearable burden in this country. No matter what, the emperor's true thoughts were deep in his heart, and he did not care how much damage the eldest princess's true power would suffer because of this. What he wanted had finally happened. Very quietly, the eldest princess moved out of the palace and returned to her own fief, Xinyang. As for what kind of conflict and power struggle there might be in the royal family because of this matter, it was not within Fan Xian's scope of consideration. Just as Wu Zhu had calculated, before the eldest princess left the capital, His Majesty had indeed generously rewarded her. At the same time, Fan Xian had also received many benefits. Although on the surface there was no relationship, it seemed that His Majesty had only praised him for bringing honor to the country. Once the edict came down, Fan Xian immediately went from an 8th-level functionary to a 5th-level functionary of the Imperial College. In the flower hall, Fan Xian held the edict and scratched his head. He asked his father, "What does a functionary of the Imperial College do?" "Teach the students of the Imperial College." Fan Jian also felt that this edict was too strange. He shook his head. "You haven't even taken the official Imperial examinations. How can you be a functionary of the Imperial College? Does that mean I don't have to take the Imperial examinations next year?" Fan Xian asked with a smile. "Yes." Fan Jian seemed to be in low spirits. He said lightly, "Not taking the Imperial examinations is not the right path. Right now it looks very smooth, but in the future there will always be some obstacles." But then he thought about it again. Wasn't what he wanted for the Fan family to be safe, and for this beautiful young man in front of him to be able to live out the rest of his life in comfort? This was also that person's idea. Otherwise, he would not have given the child the name Fan Xian. His courtesy name was Ji. Hearing that he didn't have to take the Imperial examinations, Fan Xian was overjoyed. With a face full of smiles, he returned to the study. He saw that Fan Xizha had long been waiting in the room, grinding an ink stick and looking at him. "What are you doing?" "Inscribing." "What inscription?" "Banksian's High Poetry Collection." Chapter 146. What is the Banksian's High? This is the study. Father said that this study will only be used by you in the future. We'll talk about it after you get married. I've already asked Seventh Yi, the shopkeeper, to go to the Old Hung restaurant and order a plaque. The name will be Banksian's High. Fan Xian felt that something was wrong. Then, what is the Banksian's High Poetry Anthology? The poem you recited in the hall that day has already been compiled into a collection by the imperial scholar. His Majesty was prepared to have it printed in the name of the Imperial Library. It was I who begged my father to go and ask for this errand. After the Shishan paper shop was robbed, the royal merchants were stripped of their duties and investigated. It took a long time for them to recover. In addition, the palace treasury received a warning from the palace and did not dare to target Dombo Bookstore again. Dombo Bookstore had finally recovered, so it was only natural for them to prepare for a grand project. Seventh Yi, the head shopkeeper, and Sija, the little shopkeeper, had their eyes on this poetry anthology that had been produced by the emperor at first glance. The money from the palace was only part of the reason. Furthermore, the palace had allowed it to be privately sold after it had been printed. This was a large sum of money. Who wrote this poem? Fan Xian. Who was Fan Xian? Fan Xian was the owner behind the scenes of Dombo Bookstore. Regardless of whether it was the seventh Yi shopkeeper of Qingyu Hall or Fan Sija, who stood behind the shopkeeper with a sinister smile, none of them would allow the court to benefit from this profitable business. Fan Sija had always hated his brother for refusing to hand over the last 10 chapters of Story of the Stone. Now that he had the poetry anthology, how could he let it go? Fan Xian wrote the words Banksian's High Poetry Collection on the paper and then wrote his own name, laughing bitterly in his heart. That night, in order to cover his tracks, he pretended to be drunk in the hall. As a result, he lost control of his temper and couldn't stop himself. In these poems, there were countless illusions that couldn't be explained clearly. If he wanted to explain these illusions clearly, he would need to write countless history books. You have to prepare the 4 great masterpieces, right? Did you get the book from World Talks Newspeak? Analects of Confucius? The Book of Songs? Don't complain that it's too little. An elevated version of Ziji Tongjian? A transmigration version of Sima's historical records? No one would have any objections, even if he wrote everything down. Thinking of this amount of work, Fan Xian shuddered in fear. If it really continued to expand like this, Dombo Bookstore would probably become a disseminator of the advanced culture of his previous life, fulfilling the great ambition he had made in Danzhou. He said, if the Imperial Library's revision doesn't work, you have to take it back. I'll revise it myself. I drank too much that day. Who knows what nonsense I spouted? He made up his mind. If he could fool them, then he would. If he really couldn't, then he could only endure the pain and use being drunk as an excuse to delete everything. After all, people who drank too much were prone to amnesia the next day. This is out of print. Fan Sija shook his head. I think in another 5 years, when you say that you don't want to write poems anymore, you can make a comeback in the poetry world. I think you'll earn a lot of money. Fan Xian smiled and shook his head. His gaze suddenly fell on a piece of pink paper in the corner of the study. He asked curiously, what is that? Fan Sija said, a gift list. Fan Xian was slightly startled. Only now did he remember that the day of his wedding was approaching. But with so many things that had happened recently, there was no need to hide it. His mood was slightly different from what it had been at the Temple of Qing. In the end, he and her mother could not coexist. Right now, the emperor could still control everything. When the time came, the eldest princess would certainly kill him. In other words, he would certainly kill the eldest princess. The wedding that he had been looking forward to for so long was gradually approaching, but Fan Xian felt a little uneasy and sad. A few days later, Danbo Bookstore's Banksian's High Poetry Anthology was finally published. This time, Dombo Bookstore had the right to print it, and Fan Xian personally made bold and decisive cuts. He thought he could relax a little, but unexpectedly, the the bookstore held a ceremony. Using Fan Xian's name, they invited Crown Prince Jing, Vice Minister of the Office of the Grand Herald, Xian Chuwu, and the others. Fan Xian was shocked. Only his talented sister, Fan Ro, was willing to show her face in public as a spokesperson, and they began to sell it in a lively manner. But he himself used the excuse that he wanted to maintain the mystery of a generation's immortal poet to hide in the royal courtyard and fall in love with Lin Wan. An 8th-level functionary spat out 100 poems on the spot, shocking the great Zhuang Mohan and causing him to vomit blood and flee. This story had long since spread throughout the kingdom of Qing. Although some of the poems had already spread to the common people, this poetry anthology was said to have been personally edited by the author, which was naturally very unusual. As expected, once the poetry anthology was published, paper was expensive in the capital, and Fan Xian's reputation immediately soared to another level. Last night, there was an autumn wind in the house. Fan Xian looked gently at his fiancée and smiled. The method you suggested won't work. Lin Wan frowned and cutely pouted. I haven't gone out for a few days. In fact, this young girl also knew about the recent events in the capital. Although she had grown up in the palace, the concubines all treated her as if she were in the palm of their hands. On one hand, she was weak and gentle and could not cause harm to those concubines. On the other hand, it was because His Majesty seemed to particularly love her. As for the eldest princess's words, she naturally did not see them, but she gradually heard some rumors. Later, before the eldest princess left the capital for Xinjiang, she had once come to the courtyard. Mother and daughter were actually strangers, and after sitting across from each other for a while, the eldest princess got into her carriage and left the capital. Although Lin Wan did not know what connection Fan Xian had with her mother's departure, she was sensitive enough to feel that Fan Xian's mood was not as relaxed and happy as it had been in the past. So she suggested that they find another day to go out and enjoy the autumn scenery. The red leaves of the West Mountains of the capital were very famous. But hearing the two words, West Mountains, Fan Xian thought of the paper mill that monopolized the capital's use of paper, and thought of the eldest princess behind the mill, who seemed to be looking at him gloomily and timidly. Fan Xian knew that the eldest princess's departure from the capital, the most fundamental power was still the emperor. His words only gave the emperor a reason to convince himself and the empress dowager. To explain here, the current Qing kingdom's court and commoners all called the flyers that fluttered like snowflakes that day words. This was because it was believed that when the people had no way to appeal, they would put forth their opinions. During this period of time, the capital had actually repeated this kind of words action a number of times, which made the Overwatch Council nervous for a while. Only after they had caught one of them did they find out that it was actually the hard laborers of the Taiyuan Road copper mine who had come to the capital to complain to the emperor. But they could not enter the attendance hall, so they had learned this method. The Overwatch Council went to the root of this, and in the end discovered that it was actually the West Mountain paper mill that provided these poor laborers with paper. But no matter how hard they tried, they could not dig out the person who had helped these laborers write their grievances. They only knew that the incomparably smooth handwriting came from the hands of a fortune teller next to the Temple of Qing. But when the Overwatch Council went to the Temple of Qing to search, they found that there was no fortune teller there at all, except for the high priest who seemed to have never left the temple in his life. The matter of the copper mine was naturally handled by the First Bureau. Very quickly, the officials of Taiyuan Road were arrested and brought back to the capital, where they would be executed in a month. But the court could no longer tolerate this kind of action and strengthen the control of paper. But Director Chun of the Overwatch Council did not punish the hard laborers of Copper Mountain. In the eyes of the officials, Director Chun seemed to have become much more soft-hearted. He came to his senses and looked at the slightly worried Wanner. He smiled and walked up to her, gently stroking her smooth chin. He warmly said, "What are you thinking about? The eldest princess has returned to Xinjiang. If we have a chance after we get married, we will naturally have to visit." This was of course a lie. Fan Xian hoped that he would never go to Xinjiang, and hoped that the eldest princess would grow old and die in Xinjiang. Of course, he also knew that before he could truly shake the power of the eldest princess and her mysterious companion, the emperor liked to play tricks to lure the snake out of its hole. The eldest princess would one day return. Lin Wanner forced a smile and said, "See, I entered the palace yesterday. You know what has happened in the capital recently. The ladies are fine, but the Empress Dowager seems to be a little unwell. The emperor is not as friendly to me as he used to be." Fan Xian sighed in his heart, thinking that the emperor was having a headache over who the prince was in cahoots with her mother. How could he be the same as before? The two of them chatted for a bit. Suddenly, they heard what seemed to be the sound of a nanny coming up the stairs. Fan Xian reflexively leaped up and climbed onto the windowsill, preparing to jump out. Lin Wanner giggled and said, "Are you really used to it?" Fan Xian laughed with some embarrassment. Looking at Wanner's slightly pale face, his heart was filled with tenderness. He went forward and pulled her into his arms. In a low voice, he said, "Don't tire yourself out before the wedding. As for the illness and other things, don't be afraid. You have me. You have me in the future." The green tree branches outside the window stubbornly maintained their vibrant color in the autumn wind, trying to prove that no matter how bleak the outside environment was, it still had a yearning for beauty. At the corner of the stairs, the servant girl Siki saw the young master and the young lady in each other's arms. She couldn't help but stick out her tongue playfully. She thought to herself that the young master of the Fan family was a gifted scholar, but he was still so shameless. With the wedding at hand, the entire Fan manor began to move. The eldest princess was not in the capital, so the arrangements were made by imperial concubine Shu in secret. The entire Fan manor, besides feeling proud, became even more cautious. They were afraid that they would not be careful enough and would not conform to the rules. But the rules themselves were a very difficult thing to do. Lin Wanner's status as a princess only worked in the palace. In the outside world, she was still the illegitimate daughter of Prime Minister Lin, who had only been forced by the emperor at the beginning of the year to recognize her. So whether the wedding would be carried out in the style of a princess or a normal marriage between the children of ministers could not be confirmed. Lady Lu entered the palace again and finally received clear instructions from the Empress Dowager. Although the Empress Dowager did not like the Lin family participating in the marriage of her precious granddaughter, she still had to bow her head to the rules of the world. She acquiesced to the participation of the Lin family, and at the same time announced that the wedding would not be carried out in the style of a princess. Although the high-ranking aunts of the Fan family, who knew the inside story, were a little disappointed, they thought of the marriage with the Prime Minister's family, which was also something to be proud of. So they eagerly began to make preparations. But no one had expected that the splendor of Fan Xian and Lin Wanner's wedding would be more memorable than the wedding of the princess and the son-in-law for years to come. Chapter 147. Autumn in the capital was different from other places. The red leaves of the western mountains were held by young girls in the market and sold like flowers. The white weeds of Yongyao Mark in the south were also tied into bundles and sent to the homes of the rich to ward off evil. The cool autumn wind blew through the streets and alleys of the capital, drifting over the tops of the trees and brushing the smooth cheeks of the ladies on the street. It blew away the steam rising from the restaurants, as if it wanted to blow away the dry air and gloom of the year. Tianhe Avenue was the quietest, cleanest, and most beautiful street in the capital. Both sides were lined with government offices. Today was the first day of the capital, the first of the 10 days off. It was a rare day for officials to relax, but they could not completely relax. Today was the wedding day of Fan Manor's eldest son, Fan Xian. Whether or not they were officials of the Ministry of Revenue, they had to go. This wedding was a sensation in the capital. The husband's family was a large one in the capital. Count Sinan, Fan Jian, had been favored by the emperor in recent years because of his relationship with the royal family. The Minister of Revenue had long been on sick leave at home, and in a year or two, Fan Jian would take over his position. The bridegroom, Fan Xian, was a figure who had recently risen to fame in the capital. Not to mention his heroic actions on Yolande Street half a year ago. Just the poem he had spilled in the palace last month had pushed him to the peak of popularity. Since then, Fancienne had been hiding at home, so people could not help but be curious about what this newly appointed fifth-level imperial scholar looked like. Of course, the bride was also very outstanding. Although the bride had only returned to the Lin family at the beginning of the year, she was still the daughter of the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister ruled over the world and was the head of the civil officials in the court. The marriage of his daughter was a major event. Although the Prime Minister's position in the court was not as stable as it used to be, this kind of marriage did not have any political danger, so the officials were very willing to participate. The fact that the bride and groom were illegitimate children seemed to have been collectively forgotten by the people of the capital. As for those high-ranking officials who knew the bride's true identity, they had long secretly raised the standard of their gifts by a few levels. They had long been sitting in fan manner. They were only curious in their hearts. What kind of stance would the palace express today? Fancienne was like a puppet being dressed up by the 5 old women. He swore to himself that if he had to endure this kind of torture in the future, he would run away from marriage or become a courageous anti-marriage activist. He would rather have the ease of an affair than the complications of a wedding. Wedding ceremonies in the Qing Kingdom were usually held in the evening, but today, Fancienne had been dragged out of bed before the sun had even risen. Bathing and brushing his teeth was not a big deal. After all, he had something he had made in Danzhou. But immediately after, an old woman nagged and began to use warm water to melt rouge. This scared Fancienne badly. He quickly asked her what she was going to do. It was not until now that he realized that a groom needed to put on makeup. It was clear that this matter had exceeded the limits of Fancienne's tolerance, so he shook his head and refused to allow it. Even Fan Jian personally came over to try and persuade him, but he was unable to convince him. The two sides were deadlocked for over an hour before Fancienne finally won. But because of this, time seemed to be much tighter, so 5 old women rushed in to help him dress. Fancienne had long been used to the clothing of this world, but today he still could not stand it. Inside the bright red robe, there were 3 layers of different names. On top of the robe, there were jade pendants, colorful ribbons, and flower tassels. The colors were bright and dazzling. Just putting on the robe took a lot of time, and Fancienne was so stiff that he could not move. The only thing he could move was the memory of his miserable childhood, when he and Uncle Wu Zhu used to fight with wooden sticks. Out of the corner of his eye, he looked at Lady Lu, who was busy in the room and sweating slightly. He could not help but smile bitterly. He thought to himself, is she really busy, or is she using this opportunity to get revenge? Fancienne put on the crown and the jade pendant. The silver shoe buckles hurt his feet, and the gold collar pinched his neck. Like an idiot, Fancienne was pushed to the front hall by the old women. Fan Ro and Fan Xija were also dressed very cheerfully today, especially Ro. Her usually cold face was set off by the pink clothes, and she looked particularly spirited. The sister and brother looked at their brother's pitiful appearance and covered their lips to hide their laughter. Fan Xija teased, "Where did this flour dumpling come from?" Fancienne was angry and took 2 steps forward. He did not think that he would be wearing so many ornaments that they would ring out. He laughed at himself and said, "What flour dumpling? It's clearly a moving, colorful wind chime." The most painful thing in the world was that a colorful wind chime had to be paraded through the streets. Fortunately, he did not have to ride a horse, but a sedan chair. Otherwise, Fancienne would have covered his face in shame and rushed back to Danzhou. With great difficulty, the wedding procession arrived at Lin Manor. Lin Wanner had already moved back to the Lin family 10 days earlier. They could not go to the palace to receive the bride in front of the entire capital. A series of firecrackers rang out. Fancienne sat in the sedan chair, a little absent-minded. Smelling the faint, slightly burnt smell, he did not know why, but he remembered something from long ago. He shook his head and pulled his thoughts back. He forced a smile on his already stiff face and got out of the sedan chair. According to the rules, Fancienne could not enter the house, and the Prime Minister could not go to Fan Manor today. Amidst the sound of firecrackers and flute music, the gate of Lin Manor gradually opened. The person who came out was Yuan Hongdao, the leading figure of Lin Manor. Today, this strategist had pinned a red flower on his hat, which made him look rather romantic. Master Fan. Yuan Hongdao greeted him with a face full of smiles. Fan Xian laughed bitterly in his heart. He silently cursed Yuan Hongdao for having the air of a second Yang. But he forced himself to look spirited. Mr. Yuan. The two of them had met a few times in the Prime Minister's manor and knew each other's identities. They were not strangers. Half of the experts in the capital who specialized in receiving the bride had been snatched up by Fan Manor. So as soon as Lin Manor opened its doors, the old women opened their mouths to say auspicious things. Yuan Hongdao was stunned by their words, and in a short while, the crowd rushed to the gate. Then they encountered a truly powerful resistance. As mentioned earlier, half of the experts in the capital had been snatched up by Fan Manor. Where's the other half? Of course, they had been snatched up by Lin Manor. So the two sides were spitting spittle. On the surface, they appeared to be celebrating, but in secret, they were swords without eyes. They boasted about themselves and belittled the other side. It sounded more like two extremely vulgar local tycoons getting married, rather than the Prime Minister's daughter marrying Count Sinan's son. Fan Xian laughed bitterly. He understood that this was a custom of the kingdom of Qing. Before receiving the bride and groom would quarrel in front of the manor. It was said that after this ceremony, all future quarrels between the newlyweds would be over. Because it was a custom, it was rare for such matters to damage the harmony. But whichever side won the quarrel was the highlight of the show. Either the east wind prevailed over the west wind, or the west wind prevailed over the east wind. After all, even though the bride had to follow her husband, the bride's family still had to show their strength in advance to ensure the bride's status in the complicated life of the harem. In short, between the two families, the first thing to do was to rely on the women who spoke. Fan Xian stood there in a daze. He didn't know how long they had quarreled, but he finally realized that the noise had died down. Overjoyed, he opened his eyes and shouted, "Is it done?" After an awkward silence, someone said softly, "Master Fan, it's still early." The servant of the Lin Manor found a topic of conversation. He laughed and said, "It seems that the guest is in a hurry." "That's true, our young lady." He praised his young lady again. After some time, Yuan Hongdao noticed that Fan Xian's face was a little pale. He squeezed over and whispered, "Master Fan, please bear with it. The capital is not like Danzhou. There are more rules here." Fan Xian forced a smile and said, "I'm not in a hurry." He told himself in his heart, "I've endured for more than 30 years. Of course I'm not in a hurry." After a while, this vulgar ceremony finally ended. After a round of ceremonial music, the gate of the Lin Manor slowly opened for the second time. Two matrons led the way, and the bride, Miss Lin, finally walked out. Fan Xian's eyes brightened. Today, Wanner was dressed in bright red. Her sleeves were wide, and there was boundless joy in her beauty. However, the red scarf on her head covered the beaded crown on her head and the face that he could not forget. The people of Jingdou, who had been separated on the outside to watch the excitement, beat Fan Xian to it. Their eyes lit up and they cried out. Some young people even yelled for the bride to lift the red cloth on her head to let everyone see if the bride was pretty or not. If these young people had said such things under normal circumstances, not only would the Lin family have beaten them into a pulp, but the members of the Qinian unit, who had been scattered among the crowd and secretly watching everything, would certainly lock these little bastards who had insulted their future mistress in the Overwatch Council until they died of old age. But today was a joyous day, and the emperor had to celebrate with the world when he married his wife. The Lin and Fan Manors were no exception, and it was not good to ruin the atmosphere. However, Fan Xian was not in a good mood. He glanced at those people lightly, and his subordinates understood. Immediately, a few almost inaudible cries rang out from the crowd. Presumably, the most excited young people had been kicked in the foot. After another set of routine procedures, Lin Wanner, dressed in bright red, lightly moved her feet and climbed into the bridal sedan in front of her. During the whole process, Fan Xian was not able to say a word to her. He did not look her in the eye or touch her fingertips. By the time he returned to the Fan Manor, the guests had already arrived. The ceremonial music was playing, and it was very lively. The bride was first led into the inner room to sit, and the groom stood in front of the main hall to welcome the guests. Fan Xian's face was full of smiles as he talked to people he didn't know. In a low voice, he asked the person next to him, "When will the ceremony be held?" "It's still early, young master. After the same prison, the same table, and the same equipment, there is also the same—" Fan Xian did not hear the rest of the words. He just suppressed the urge to curse and told himself not to rush. He had said it before. He had already waited for more than 30 years. What was there to rush? Chapter 148. Fan Xian didn't remember what he had eaten for lunch. He only remembered that he had drunk a lot of wine and had been persuaded by officials with good intentions or greed to write 2 poems to describe the occasion. But no matter how much Fan Xian drank, he remembered his declaration to retire from the world of poetry. He smiled and declined each one. In the middle of the banquet, the people from King Jing's manor finally arrived. All the officials rose to greet them. Looking at the garden-like prince, Fan Xian smiled bitterly and wondered why he hadn't recognized him the first time he saw him. King Jing had always liked Fan Xian. Seeing him dressed so flashily today, he said in a muffled voice, "He doesn't know how to dress up." Fan Xian knew his personality. He smiled and said, "I wonder what His Highness was like during his wedding." Crown Prince Li Hongzhi lowered his voice. "Probably not as good as you." King Jing flew into a rage. "You weren't even born when I got married. What the hell do you know?" The officials watching the prince and the crown prince quarrel didn't dare say anything. They all hid to one side and snickered. Count Sinan, Fan Jian, was the host. He shook his head and smiled bitterly. "Your Highness, your words are unnecessary." Although he was a count, the 2 families had been friends for over 10 years, so he spoke casually to King Jing. King Jing waved his hand, no longer paying attention to the little ones. He followed Fan Jian into the inner hall. Halfway there, he stopped and turned to face Fan Xian. "You're not bad." Fan Xian was startled. He quickly bowed and thanked him. Imperial Prince Jing frowned again and said, "I was originally thinking that after 2 years, I would give Rugia to you. I didn't expect that my older sister would steal my son-in-law away from me." He seemed to really regret it as he shook his head and walked inside. Who was King Jing's sister? Naturally, it was Fan Xian's mother-in-law, the eldest princess. Fortunately, he had spoken in a low voice, so no one heard. But when Fan Xian heard that the prince was going to give Princess Rugia to him, he couldn't help but feel afraid. If he had to marry Rugia, it would be a terrible thing. Then he thought of his mother-in-law. She looked much younger than the prince, and he couldn't help but wonder. As his mind wandered, Li Hongcheng patted him on the shoulder and said quietly, "Given our friendship, I should have come earlier. But you also know that it is not convenient for me to come too early on an occasion like this." Fan Xian understood that although Li Hongcheng had a good relationship with him, he was still Crown Prince Jing. There was no reason for him to rush to help the son of an official. That would be against the rules. He smiled and was about to say something when he heard Li Hongcheng say quietly, "Rugia did not come today. She asked me to tell you." Fan Xian raised his eyebrows. Rugia had always been on good terms with Ruoruo and had a good relationship with him. Why hadn't she come to his wedding? Seeing his expression, Li Hongcheng smiled bitterly and said, "My sister is wiping away her tears in the manor. What father said earlier was true. If it weren't for the fact that your fiancé also has a great background, father might actually ask the Empress Dowager to come forward and have you marry Rugia instead." Fan Xian was startled at first. Shortly after, he felt bitter in his heart. He realized that he really didn't know what to say today. It was better to keep his mouth shut. Finally, it was time to bow to heaven and earth. Fan Xian and Lin Wanner held the ends of the red silk and looked at each other lovingly through the red cloth. They slowly and softly bowed down. The sourness of the gesture moved Revo to tears, and Fan Xija, who was next to her, was so mushy that he wanted to go crazy. As they bowed to their parents, Count Sinan, Fan Jian, gently stroked his beard while Lady Lu, somewhat bashfully, sat on the matriarch's seat. The officials and nobles watching the ceremony were puzzled. Why had Lady Lu been promoted? They didn't know that this was the result of a month of secret planning by Fan Xian. Fan Xian was not a person who repaid evil with good, but he was also not a person who held grudges. Although he could not remove his vigilance toward Lady Lu, he could see that she was truly devoted to her father. If he promoted Lady Lu to the official position, he could appease Lady Lu's influence and, at the same time, make him feel more at ease. Of course, if Lady Lu did anything unfavorable to him, Fan Xian now had enough power to protect himself and harm his enemies. He just didn't want to do it. After all, according to his own conjecture, Lady Lu was a person with a hard life, and now there was Fan Xija between the two of them. Count Sinan, Fan Jian, had never nodded. But last night, the palace finally sent word that the Empress Dowager had spoken, and he had no choice but to acquiesce. After enduring for 10 years, Lady Lu finally sat on the matriarch's seat. She touched the smooth armrest of the chair uncomfortably and uneasily accepted the tea the bride handed her. She took a sip, not knowing the taste, and looked at Fan Xian with an uneasy gaze. Fan Xian's eyes did not look at her. He only smiled and offered his father tea. With great difficulty, Lady Lu's lips curled into a smile. Because the officials present did not know the inside story, they could not help but look confused. And in the side hall, the officials of Lady Lu's paternal family watched this scene and could not help but sigh. At that moment, there was a commotion outside the manor. Fan Xian stood up, and the matchmaker helped wander up. The whole family looked outside. An edict has arrived. Lady Fan received the edict. Eunuch Ho, who was familiar with the Fan family, pushed open the door with a smile and announced the edict from the palace. Today was a joyous day, and both Fan Jian and Fan Xian had guessed that the palace would have made arrangements, so they were not surprised. But the officials of the 6 ministries in the courtyard were surprised. Eunuch Ho's edict did not conform to the rules of the palace. The amount of gold and silk far exceeded the norm, and some items of tribute were also on the list. No matter how they looked at it, it did not seem like a reward for a minister's son's marriage. It seemed more like a marriage between a princess or a prince. Even if it was a marriage between the prime minister and Count Sinan, the royal family should not have paid so much attention. As Fan Xian listened to the edict, he whispered to his wife, who was under the red veil. "Do you understand? I am basking in your glory, husband." Lin Wanner was bashful under the red veil. After Eunuch Ho left, the officials let out a sigh of relief. Unexpectedly, they heard a shout from outside. The marriage between Fan and Lin is a match made in heaven. Imperial concubine Shu rewards them. Fan Xian was startled. He and Wanner bowed again. Imperial concubine Shu rewarded them with the original set of rare books. Imperial concubine Shu was the mother of the second prince. Unexpectedly, she was also acquainted with the Fan manor. The officials could not help but click their tongues in wonder. Unexpectedly, after a while, they heard another shout from outside. The marriage between Fan and Lin is a match made in heaven. Ning the Talented congratulates you. The officials were shocked again. Although this talented woman did not have a high status, her only son was the great prince. He had always led troops outside and was highly regarded by the emperor. Ning the Talented's gift was a sword, which suited her temperament of Dongi origin. Fan Xian and Wanner had no choice but to bow again. Taking the sword with a bitter smile, Fan Xian whispered to his wife, "Do you see? Now it's the concubine's turn to reward you. Ning the Talented, this sword is for you. If anything goes wrong, you can use it to cut me down." Lin Wanner was bashful again. Under the watchful eyes of the crowd, she could not take a bite out of this wretched Lang Jun. Since Imperial concubine Shu and Ning the Talented had sent gifts, the other concubines naturally sent gifts as well. It was just that the ones who were not well known sent gifts together. Only Imperial concubine Ning was a member of the Liu family, so she was particularly different. Furthermore, she had received the news last night that Lady Liu had finally been promoted. In her joy, she had acted ruthlessly. Just the gift list alone was 2 feet thick, and it shocked the officials in the council. After the concubines, it was the Empress' gift. As the mother of the country, the Empress' gift was not ordinary. It was a sparkling and translucent jade scepter. It was very precious and indescribable. Today, the officials had finally opened their eyes. Since the founding of the Kingdom of Qing, there had not been a child of an official whose marriage had alarmed so many nobles in the palace. Of course, the officials who knew Lin Wanner's true identity knew the inside story. Not only was Lin Wanner the illegitimate daughter of the eldest princess, but she had always been favored by the emperor and the empress dowager. Growing up in the palace, she had a special relationship with these nobles. Gradually, the tables in the courtyard quieted down. The officials of the 6 ministries finally understood what was going on. At this moment, their expressions became much more restrained and dignified. The way they looked at the bride became somewhat strange. Finally, the most important bombshell was dropped. The emperor's handwritten letter was carried into Fan Manor by the eunuchs like a treasure. A large number of people in the courtyard knelt down. By the decree of the heavens, the emperor has decreed that the marriage between Fan and Lin will be completed at an auspicious time. Write this as a blessing. Fan Jian and Fan Xian carefully took it and unfolded it for everyone to see. On the pure white paper, there were 4 large words, 100 years of bliss. It was a very simple meaning, but the emperor, who did not like to get involved in the family affairs of his officials, had written it himself. The hidden meaning was not simple. Everyone in the courtyard guessed that Fan Xian had married Lin Wanner. He was as lucky as picking up a big ingot. In a room deep in the palace, the emperor of the Kingdom of Qing was smiling as he looked at a painting. The painting was of a yellow-robed woman. The emperor had married Wanner, whom he admired the most, to Fan Xian. He thought that the woman in the painting would also like this daughter-in-law. For Fan Lin's marriage to be so grand, everyone thought that it was because the emperor loved Wanner. Even the concubines in the palace did not think of anything else. But the emperor knew that he only wanted to make up for the regret of Fan Xian not being able to marry as a prince. The emperor looked at the woman in the painting, and a smile rose to the corners of his lips. He used to like this kind of excitement. I hope he likes it too. Chapter 149. Only a young girl who had read too many romance novels would like this kind of wedding scene. In any case, Fan Xian did not like it very much. His state of mind was calm enough not to be moved by these rewards from the palace. Furthermore, in his heart, as well as the hearts of the guests watching the ceremony, they all thought that these rewards were for Princess Chun, Lin Wanner. Fan Xian felt that every time the palace came to reward him, he had to kneel and salute. His waist and knees could not take it anymore, and he began to miss Wu Zhu's staff. Amidst a burst of celebratory music, the marriage between the Fan and Lin families finally came to an end. The newlyweds were escorted into the bridal chamber, and the guests began to leave. It was a strange day. Aside from King Jing, none of the officials drank too much. Count Sinan looked at the young couple being helped into the bridal chamber, and a gentle smile appeared on his face. What he had been most worried about today had not happened. It seemed that the crown prince and the second prince also knew that attending their son's wedding ceremony without regard for their status would arouse the vigilance of the palace and conflict with Fan Xian. But the crown prince and the second prince still had people send over heavy gifts. At nightfall, the newlyweds finally arrived at the newly built garden with the help of the servant girls and returned to their own residence. The place was also brightly lit with red candles, and everywhere was plastered with the character Happy. It was a very festive red. Here, Fan Xian finally relaxed. Some of these servant girls had been bought by him, some had been gifted by King Jing, and a few had come from the palace with Wanner. Basically, they were still somewhat afraid of a young master like him. He entered the room, stretched, and smiled as he called for everyone to leave. The servant girls in the manor all kowtowed to the newlyweds outside the door. Wanner's personal servant girl, Siki, hurriedly took out some money to distribute. Siki, you must be tired. Go to sleep. Fan Xian smiled as he spoke, his brows furrowed into a wise shape. Siki looked at her mistress with some embarrassment, thinking that she had not drunk the joyous wine yet. At that moment, she saw Lin Wanner's hand, which was on her lap under the red veil, wave imperceptibly, as if to chase someone out. The servant girl covered her mouth and laughed, then hurried out of the bridal chamber and closed the wooden door. Only Fan Xian and Wanner were left in the room. Come out, if you don't want me to hit you, Fan Xian said coldly, to Lin Wanner's surprise. As expected, Fan Xija wriggled his fat body out from under the bed with great difficulty, then rushed out with his head down. Fan Xian frowned. Don't you think the toilet behind the bed will suffocate him to death? Lin Wanner giggled under the red veil. This toilet hasn't been used. Fan Xian thought that was true. The toilet was painted with gold, and the inside was covered with vanilla. Seeing that there was no one around, and that the red candles were still and flowing like jade, he rolled his eyes and chuckled. He walked forward and held Lin Wanner's slightly cold hands that were exposed behind her wide sleeves. He suddenly thought of Uncle Wuzhu. If that great grandmaster liked to stand in the corner as usual, then when the two of them were enjoying themselves in bed and saw the ghost in the corner, Fan Xian would not be so scared that he would get sick in that area. He quickly coughed twice and said softly, Is Uncle here? Uncle was not here. Being held by him, Lin Wanner thought of what was about to happen. She had long been embarrassed. Suddenly hearing him call her uncle, she couldn't help but be confused. Nothing. Fan Xian smiled. In the future, when things are settled, I'll let you see him. Oh. Lin Wanner was confused. She didn't know who he was talking about. Wife. Fan Xian did not follow the rules and used the ruler to lift up the red veil on Wanner's head. Instead, he gently used 2 fingers to pick up one side of the red cloth and slowly lifted it up. He saw the red cloth gradually move up, revealing a girl's slightly lowered and bashful jade-white chin. Above it were 2 soft lips, the tip of her nose slightly raised, and her eyes tightly shut because of nervousness. Her long eyelashes trembled slightly. The red candles gradually dimmed. Fan Xian nervously sat on the side of the bed. The thumb of his right hand gently stroked his wife's smooth cheek under her ear. Cough, cough. 2 very untimely coughs came from outside the room. Then came the sound of Fan Xian's personal guards unsheathing their swords, grunting as they fell to the ground, and finally, the surprise cry of Wang Qinian, who was on duty tonight. Fan Xian's brows furrowed. He had already burst through the door. The bright red wedding robe on his body floated out like a red cloud. In the dark night, it was particularly alluring. The red cloud floated, and he couldn't see clearly who it was. With a shake of his wrist and a shift of his feet, he had already avoided the palm that the other person had sent to his shoulder. Spontaneously, he took out a thin needle and pierced it into the other person's shoulder. The poison on the needle was very strong. Presumably, the other person would not be able to move. At this moment, out of the corner of his eye, he saw that 3 or 4 of the guards in front of the stone steps had already fallen unconscious. Wang Qinian, however, was looking behind him with a face full of fear. Fan Xian was shocked. Who in this world could be poisoned by his own poison and still be able to move? Feeling the sound of breaking wind coming from behind him, he gave a muffled grunt. Turning his palm into a knife, he swung it out. Just as the knife was about to hit the person's face, Fan Xian let out a pained groan. Hugging his stomach, he squatted down. One reason was that the person couldn't hit him, and the other reason was that he had been poisoned. The person's hair was somewhat messy, and his face was full of hardships. He was very old, but his true appearance could not be seen. A pair of cold and gloomy eyes were dyed a light brown color. He looked very frightening. Teacher, Fan Xian cried out in surprise. His stomach felt a sharp pain. Not daring to be careless, he quickly took out an antidote pill from his belt and chewed it. He didn't know if it was right. Then he hurried forward to greet him, hug him, and silently criticize him. He was touched that Fei Jie, whom he hadn't seen for 10 years, had suddenly arrived today. Your appearance hasn't changed much. Fei Jie sat in the study, drinking tea and enjoying the servant girl's leg massage. He looked at Fan Xian, who was standing next to him. I thought that after 10 years, I wouldn't be able to recognize you. I didn't expect you to be so beautiful. Fan Xian sighed, but didn't dare to sit down. He said, Teacher, can you, even if it's just once, don't sneak into my room in the middle of the night. It's easy to cause a misunderstanding. Although students use soft pillows in their rooms now, what if I had stabbed you with a knife just now? You are clearly the weakest in martial arts among the 8 bureaus, but you still like to dress up as a night ranger. It's very dangerous. In fact, Fan Xian had imagined the scene after his reunion with Fei Jie countless times. It could be that the two of them would hug each other and cry bitterly. It could also be that they would pour each other poison tea to test their skills after parting. But he had never thought that on the day of his wedding, when the night of spring was short, this old man would come to disturb him. Originally, some thoughts of parting with his teacher had long since turned into unsatisfied anger. It must be known that today had been tormented all day. Fan Xian had comforted himself that he had endured for 30 years. What was there to be anxious about? Seeing that he was about to succeed, he had been disturbed by this old poisonous creature. Fan Xian had no choice but to be anxious. He thought to himself, why did you have to come today? Fei Jie didn't care about him at all. He said, I just came back from Dongi. I heard about your wedding, so I hurried for a few days and finally made it. Fan Xian's heart was moved. He quickly bowed deeply. For him to be able to live to this day in this world, the person in front of him should be one of the 2 people who had done the most. Fei Jie handed him a small box. A faint fragrance floated out from a box. Fan Xian asked in surprise, what is this? A gift for my student's wedding. What do you think? Fan Xian knew that the gift his teacher had brought out must be extraordinary. Opening it, he found that there were a few pills the size of a pinky finger. His heart jumped. He used his fingernail to pick up some powder and put in his mouth to taste. Fei Jie looked at his movements and smiled slightly. The old man was also very relieved that the beautiful little child had become the elegant young man he was today, especially when he saw that he still retained the professional habits he had taught him in the past. Fei Jie was even more comforted. Turtle shell, made of vinegar. Fan Xian frowned as he analyzed the ingredients in the pill. Rehmannia, donkey hide gelatin, beeswax, but there's one medicine that I can't taste. I smoke. Fei Jie's lips curled up. He seemed to be somewhat proud. I smoke? Fan Xian had already guessed what the pill was for. Thinking of his teacher's astonishing methods, he couldn't help but feel a lot more confident. He asked in surprise. Correct. It is a medicine from overseas. Dongi has been a merchant for generations. For years ago, I asked them to look for it. They finally found it this year, so I stayed there for a few more days to wait for the ship to arrive. Fei Jie waved his hand, letting the serving girl leave. 4 years ago was the first time the palace had discussed the marriage between the Fan and Lin families. It turned out that from then on, Fei Jie had begun to treat Lin Wanner's tuberculosis. He wanted his student to marry a healthy wife. Thinking of this, Fan Xian couldn't help but feel moved. I have something else to do in Dongi. Fan Xian understood. I sold out the favor I owed Sigajin back, then in exchange for a promise from them not to make trouble for you. Fan Xian sat down next to his teacher. He could no longer feel any resentment towards him for interrupting his romantic night. He said gratefully, Thank you, teacher, for the medicine. Thank you, teacher. This is my first time making this medicine, but I've tested it. It works. Fei Jie smiled slightly. A clear light flashed through his light brown eyes. But there are some side effects. You must listen carefully. Teacher, please speak. Seeing Fei Jie's seriousness, Fan Xian's expression also became serious. Chapter 150. After taking the medicine, you will be forbidden from sexual intercourse for a month. Fei Jie smiled, hiding the true side effects. You are so cruel. Fan Xian stared into his teacher's eyes, wishing he could bite him to death. Then I'll let one take the medicine tomorrow, Fan Xian said worriedly. Fei Jie almost spat his tea on his face. He pointed at his nose. You are so strong. There are countless brothels in the capital. Do you really have to be in such a hurry tonight? Fan Xian chuckled. Because I know you were playing with me. Fei Jie really couldn't do anything to this pretty boy. He wasn't his match 10 years ago, and 10 years later, he was even less of a match. He could only stand up angrily. Am I destined to owe you something in my previous life? You can guess everything. Fan Xian quickly stood up and comforted him. Because you love me, teacher. Fei Jie suddenly looked into his eyes and was silent for a long time. Because the study was new, the smell of wood still wafted through the room. The atmosphere was a little strange. After a long time, Fei Jie said lightly, You've been in the capital for a long time, and you've been to the Overwatch Council. I presume you already know some things. I know some. Fan Xian's smile was pure. For example, I know about my mother, but I still don't know about my father. He looked into Fei Jie's eyes. Even someone as ruthless and vicious as Fei Jie felt the pressure. He smiled and changed the topic. It was quite clever, and Fan Xian couldn't press him any further. I presume you know that the lady established the Yi family with her left hand and the Overwatch Council with her right. Now, both Count Sinan and the director want you to take over. It's just that Count Sinan wants you to take over the business of the palace treasury, and the director seems to want you to take over the Overwatch Council. Fan Xian shook his head. Teacher, the token you gave me back then was actually a commissioner token. Actually, once I understood what this token represented, I knew what might happen next. What is your opinion? My opinion is actually different from the director's. Fei Jie seemed a little depressed. The Overwatch Council is too close to the Emperor and can easily be dragged into those terrible political struggles. Although the palace treasury is also a hot potato, it is easier to control than the Overwatch Council. Fan Xian nodded, but he smiled bitterly in his heart. He thought that he seemed to have long been involved in those palace struggles. Even the eldest princess being forced to leave Jingdo seemed to have something to do with him. After thinking for a while, he smiled and said, Teacher, don't waste your energy. You must be tired from the journey, so stay in the manor for the time being. As for the future, let's not talk about whether or not I want to accept Mother's inheritance. I'm afraid that even if Director Chun and Father wanted to give it to me, there would be many people who wouldn't be willing. Fei Jie nodded and said gravely, This matter is very complicated, and I don't think the Prime Minister will stay in court for much longer. Fan Xian furrowed his brows. His father-in-law had long since shaken off the Wu Bowen incident. What could have happened? Fei Jie didn't explain. He only quietly asked, Is Sir Wu in the capital now? Fan Xian didn't think for a moment. He said directly, After I enter the capital, he left. I think he went to the South Sea to find Yi Luyan. I'm not sure what he wanted. Fei Jie shook his head and suddenly looked at Fan Xian. He frowned and reprimanded him. I hear that you like to write poems in the capital, and that you've made a name for yourself. Fan Xian smiled with some embarrassment. Teacher, you know that I've liked to write sour things since I was young. Fei Jie sighed and said, It seems that the so-called salt cellar old XN was also your excuse. Fan Xian chuckled twice. Fei Jie couldn't help but shake his head again. He looked at him and said, Your mother used to be extremely talented, but she despised sour, rotten people. After you entered the capital, you spent all your time pondering these petty tricks. If your mother could see you in heaven, wouldn't she be half dead with anger? Fan Xian shrugged. In his previous life, his mother was probably the most terrifying female science professor. Naturally, the path she took was different from his. Fei Jie refused Fan Xian's request to stay the night. He also had a house in the capital. As he prepared to leave, Fan Xian finally couldn't help but ask a question. Teacher, back then, you, Chen Pingping, and Uncle Wu Zhu were always with my mother, right? Yes. Did my mother get some medicine from you? What medicine? Fan Xian shook his head helplessly. Aphrodisiac or knockout drug. Fei Jie seemed to think of something. A strange expression appeared on his face. He smiled darkly. You've just gotten married, and you already need these things? The next morning, Magpies chirped incessantly on the branches. Even the gradually yellowing leaves seemed to be stained with happiness and became much more tender. The morning sun shone through the courtyard, filling the courtyard with a faint, warm color. The grass and flowers in the courtyard and the slanted stone path were all stained with dew. It looked very peaceful. With a squeak, Fancien pushed open the door and stretched. His face was slightly tired, but his eyes were incomparably clear. He yawned and smiled. He waved behind him. Hurry up and come out. The season of the day is in the morning. Why are you lazing around in bed? Lin Wan-er's shy and anxious reply came from inside the room. I've never seen someone as shameless as you. Hurry up and close the door. Fancien laughed. It's so early in the morning. Yesterday's wedding, the servants are all tired. I'm afraid we'll be the first to wake up in the courtyard. As soon as he finished speaking, he heard a group of men and women appear out of nowhere from the front and back of the courtyard. They bowed to Fancien and said, "Good morning, young master." Fancien was startled. He quickly returned to his room and closed the door. After a while, the servant girls came in to help the newlyweds wash up. Only then did they put on their clothes and walk out the door. Fancien carefully held Wan-er's hand. Looking at his wife's angry face, he smiled. I spent some time with my teacher last night, so I didn't get much time. I'll make up for it tonight. Lin Wan-er had grown up in the palace and was careful with her words. Now that she had married a husband who liked to talk nonsense, she blushed. You're not being serious again. Fancien held her cool little hand and smiled. Ever since we were by the lake, we've been reading the scriptures. You're doing it again. From today onwards, you must call me husband. Yes, husband. Lin Wan-er's shy and obedient manner was very lovable. Hearing the word husband, Fancien thought of mahjong. He thought of his life's miraculous encounters. He thought of last night's madness, the beauty of the spring night, and the eldest princess who had been driven out of her fief by the emperor. He couldn't help but smile. I really do seem to have drawn a few more tiles than others. Since entering the capital, he had finally found the feeling of happiness. He couldn't help but sing in a low voice, I've left many feelings in the capital. Lin Wan-er, who was in his arms, opened her big, innocent eyes and didn't understand a single word. Entering the fan manor from the corner of the garden, it was another bustling scene. The servants and servants stood on both sides to welcome the newlyweds. They all knew that this young mistress was an extraordinary person. On the day of the wedding last night, the continuous reward from the palace had shocked all the Fan clansmen. After finishing his wife's tea, Fan Jian amiably let the two of them rise. He then chatted with Wan-er about Prime Minister Lin's health, and then let the two of them rest in peace. Seeing the new son and the new wife so well matched, Count Sinan felt comforted, and Fan Rou was also very happy for her brother. The two of them returned to their own courtyard and heard a commotion outside. The servant opened the door and saw that the people from the Fan Manor in the suburbs of the capital had come to deliver gifts. Naturally, Fancien and Lin Wan-er didn't need to personally meet these people. They just had to send them away. But Teng Zijing and his wife had also come today, which surprised Fancien. Are your legs better? Fancien sat in the main seat and looked at Teng Zijing's legs with concern. Teng Zijing laughed. They've been better for a long time. It's just a little inconvenient to walk. Fancien smiled at Lin Wan-er beside him. Teng Zijing was the one who prepared the roe deer meat and white elk meat that I sent you a few days ago. Lin Wan-er smiled slightly and nodded. It had only been a night, but she had transformed from a young girl into a mature matriarch. It had to be said that life changes were always so sudden. After talking for a while, Teng Zijing and his wife were led away to rest. After they left, Teng Zijing's wife whispered curiously, "This young mistress is quite noble, but her body seems a little weak. I'm afraid she's not good enough for the young master." Teng Zijing was shocked and reprimanded her. "The young mistress is a true noble. Be careful that if someone else hears this, they'll tear your mouth apart." Teng Zijing's wife still had the charm of a young married woman and smiled non-committally. It's just that the bride isn't as handsome as the groom. It's a little funny. Teng Zijing also smiled. In this capital, It's not so easy to find a girl more handsome than the young master. On the other side of the story, Grandmother Danjo's gift had been delayed on the road for a number of days. Today, it had finally arrived at Fan Manor. Fan Jian naturally went out to greet it, and he also had someone notify the young couple. Fan Xian was full of joy. Holding Wan Er's hand, he walked to the entrance of the courtyard. As they walked, he said, "Grandmother loves me the most. I wonder what she'll give us." When they reached the entrance of the manor, Fan Xian was stunned. He had never thought that Grandmother would give him a wedding gift. Cece looked at the young master she had served for many years with a face full of joy. She had already bowed. "Greetings, young master. Greetings, mistress." Chapter 151. Fan Xian had not thought that his grandmother would send Cece, who was far away in Danzhou, to Jingdou. Looking at the girl he had spent many peaceful years with, he was happy but also had a headache. He didn't know what to do. His grandmother's meaning was clear. She wanted him to take Cece into his room. Looking at Cece's appearance, she probably wouldn't choose any other solution. "Go rest first." Fan Xian did his best to appear gentle. However, Cece still felt that the young master in front of her seemed to have become somewhat unfamiliar. After all, Fan Xian had endured too many trials and struggles in Jingdou. Other than his steadiness, his temperament had also gained an indescribable quality. Seeing Cece's somewhat uneasy expression, Fan Xian laughed and said, "This girl, what are you thinking now? After you've eaten and drunk your fill, I'll take you for a stroll around the capital." Cece felt wronged and said, "Cece is here to serve you, not for you to serve me." Fan Xian felt good hearing this. After all, this was a girl who had grown up with him. Her words and actions were much more direct. Unlike the servant girls of the Fan family in Jingdou, they didn't even dare to breathe loudly in front of him, much less refute his intentions. Fan Xian walked forward and gently patted her slightly thin cheek. Smiling, he said, Fine, I'll let you serve me. Even if you have to copy books and grind ink, you have to wash it off first. My whole body is sore. Everyone says that a beautiful sleeve adds fragrance to reading at night. Are you going to add some vinegar for me?" The Qin kingdom did not have the story of Feng Xuanling's wife drinking vinegar to show her determination, so no one could hear the playfulness in these words. Fan Xian couldn't help but feel a bit of regret for casting pearls before swine. Cece was embarrassed and embarrassed. She bowed again and then followed the servant girl to freshen up. These servant girls had long seen that this servant girl was different from them, so they were especially polite. So this girl is Cece? There was no jealousy as Fan Xian had expected. There was only curiosity on Lin Wanner's face. She smiled and said, "I've always heard you say that the girl in Danzhou is much more diligent than Siki. Today we finally meet." After all, the kingdom of Qing was still a world where men were superior to women. Although Lin Wanner was a princess, she did not seem to have too many thoughts or sensibilities. Besides, even if Fan Xian were to take a concubine, would a princess be jealous of those women? Fan Xian smiled. Fortunately, this matter had nothing to do with him. Otherwise, if he had made the little tiger unhappy, would he still have his arms? "Marriage is the grave of love," Fan Xian said sourly. "So we have to walk more? Don't become a pair of zombies." Lin Wanner frowned and pouted. "I'm afraid of the cold," she said pitifully. "The snow in Song Mountain is good, especially in autumn and winter." Fan Xian looked at his wife with a smile, tempting her like a staff member of a travel agency. "Although the medicine my teacher gave you is very effective, and the imperial physicians were pleasantly surprised after taking your pulse, a high-altitude place will be very beneficial to your body." Lin Wanner tilted her head and leaned against his chest. She gently rubbed against him and said softly, "I still don't understand what altitude means." "It means how much higher it is compared to the surface of the sea." Fan Xian felt this explanation was a bit awkward. "I still don't understand," Lin Wanner said with a pained expression. "Can we not go? I'm afraid of climbing mountains. I'm afraid of the cold." Fan Xian said unhappily, "Look at how round your face is now. There's no harm in exercising more. Lin Wanner suddenly struggled out of his arms and said with a pained expression, "Last night, you said you like me to be a bit fatter." Fan Xian almost laughed, but he still suppressed it and said seriously, "Turn off the lights. Of course, being a bit fatter is good, but looking at you during the day, it's better to be a bit thinner." Lin Wanner huffed angrily and rushed to walk in the corridor. Fan Xian hurriedly followed, not looking at her directly. He was only a step ahead and quietly said, "I like the fleshy parts of your body the most, don't you know?" In the autumn palace, it was like a gust of summer wind was blowing in the face. Lin Wanner's face heated up, and in a moment, she blushed. She took 2 steps forward and grabbed Fan Xian's hand. She lowered her head and said, "There are so many people following behind us. Don't you feel ashamed?" The 2 of them were in the palace, followed by a large group of old women, eunuchs, and palace maids. But those people all had their heads down and were some distance away from Fan Xian and Lin Wanner. Presumably, they hadn't heard what the young couple had said. Fan Xian's face was still facing forward. He smiled and said, "My wife, you must learn from your husband how to do many earth-shattering things without changing your expression." There was a hidden meaning to this, but Lin Wanner didn't understand. Today was the first time the 2 of them had entered the palace since their wedding. When the concubines saw Lin Wanner, they all hugged their sweethearts and called out to them, giving them gifts. Fan Xian didn't refuse any of them, but seeing how worried the concubines were for Lin Wanner, he couldn't help but feel a chill in his heart. This woman's family was from the royal family. If there was a conflict between the couple in the future, wouldn't he die without a burial? His Majesty the Emperor had 4 sons, the Crown Prince and the 3rd Prince. This proved that he was not a womanizer. Coincidentally, of all the concubines in the palace, none of them had given birth to a princess. So Lin Wanner, who had been raised in the palace, naturally became the concubine's favorite. Lin Wanner was used to the palace, so she wasn't as nervous as Fan Xian had been when he first entered the palace. Instead, it was as if she were playing in the back garden of her home. Fan Xian was affected by this, and the eldest princess, whom he hated the most, had now returned to her fiefdom, Xinyan. So he relaxed and followed her around the palace. Earlier, when he had met with the empress, Fan Xian had already brought up the matter of going to the Tsang Mountains for a vacation, and he had obtained the approval of the nobility in the palace. Unexpectedly, Wanner was a silly girl who was afraid of the cold. But Fan Xian had already made up his mind, especially after the new year, when the exchange of prisoners between the kingdom of Qing and northern Qi would officially begin. The Overwatch Council had sent word through Wang Qinian. It seemed that this matter had something to do with Fan Xian, so he needed a quiet place to deal with some matters and prepare some things. But it was a pity that when he entered the palace, he did not see his uncle, the emperor. Lin Wanner was a little disappointed. Fan Xian's calm face hid some other emotions. A procession of carriages set off from Fan Manor. Today, Prime Minister Lin had also come to see off his beloved daughter, so the scene seemed even more grand. The pedestrians on the street were also pointing at the procession. After all, a few days ago, the Fan and Lin families had united by marriage, and the wedding scene had shocked half the capital. Who would have thought that in just a few days, the immortal poet of the Fan family would cause such a ruckus? Why are you leaving the capital so soon after getting married? An old man in the crowd frowned, his hands behind his back. Young people these days, relying on their family's wealth and power, only know how to play around. I heard that Master Fan is also a professor at the Imperial College. Why are you going to the Tsang Mountains? Look, don't you understand? A young man next to him laughed. Master Fan is going on a honeymoon. He has to specifically pick a secluded place. What is a honeymoon? A sister-in-law was interested. It means that life is as sweet as honey. Another poor man, who was obviously related to Fan Manor, laughed mockingly. You don't even know that? It's a new phrase invented by Master Fan. The sister-in-law was angry. That's a weird phrase. What's there to know? Besides, what honeymoon? If you want to pick a secluded place to stay for a few days, then don't you understand? Isn't it just for the sake of peace, happiness, and having a fat boy? Sitting in the carriage leaving the capital, On his left was Lin Wanner, who was curled up in her fur coat like a cat. She looked at Fan Xian with a smile in her eyes that were like spring water. On his left was the gentle and courteous Fan Ro, who was currently peeling an orange, carefully picking the white strands from the flesh, and then putting the pieces into Fan Xian's mouth. Fan Xian half closed his eyes. Out of the corner of his eye, he glanced at Lin Wanner's expression. He couldn't help but frown. "It's only autumn. Why are you so afraid of the cold?" Lin Wanner giggled and climbed up. She moved closer to him and opened her mouth. Fan Xian's heart trembled. He heard her say to Ruo, "Good sister, give me an orange." Fan Ruo smiled. "Sister-in-law, you can't eat oranges when you're sick. You'll get sick." Lin Wanner frowned. "That's annoying." Fan Xian didn't understand how his wife and sister addressed each other. "One calls me sister, and the other calls me sister-in-law. What kind of dress is that?" Lin Wanner stuck out her tongue. "I'm used to calling her sister." Fan Ruo couldn't help but laugh. She pointed at her brother's nose. "Before you got married, my brother told me to call you sister-in-law, so I'm used to it." Fan Xian shook his head helplessly. The carriage was warm, and after leaving the capital, it was easy to get sleepy. Lin Wanner leaned on Fan Xian's shoulder, and Ruo rested against the carriage wall. The carriage suddenly shook, waking Wanner from her sleep. She rubbed her eyes and asked, "Are we there yet? How can we be so fast?" Fan Xian smiled and shook his head. Although the villa in the Tsang Mountains can't compare to the one in the palace, it's still halfway up the mountain. It'll take 3 days to get out of the capital. Lin Wanner looked at him calmly. Leaving the capital so soon after marriage, other than to recuperate, what other reason is there? Fan Xian knew he couldn't hide this from her, and he didn't want to hide it. He smiled. "Your 2 cousins send people to the manor every day. I'm scared, so of course I have to hide." Choosing sides at this time, no matter which side, is a stupid thing to do. Chapter 152. 2 days later, the carriages slowly entered the middle of Tsang Mountain. The magnificent Tsang Mountain was incomparably majestic. Hundreds of years ago, a generation of emperors had used hundreds of thousands of hard laborers to forcefully open up an official road that allowed carriages to pass through the mountains. This was to facilitate his summer vacations in the Tsang Mountain. But in fact, not long after this huge, laborious road was completed, the emperor died on top of the soft bodies of his concubines. Unexpectedly, it had never been used even once. In the past few hundred years, the world had risen and fallen countless times, but gradually, this mountain closest to the capital had become the back garden of high officials and nobles. Since the previous dynasty, many laws had been issued, establishing the extremely thick air of officialdom on Tsang Mountain. Even the cold mountain wind could not blow it away. From then on, Tsang Mountain forbade hunting, burning forests to open up wastelands, and everything that poor people could do was prohibited. Tsang Mountain became purely a vacation spot for the rich. Nowadays, in addition to a few temples for ascetic cultivators and some hermits, the rest of the land was given by the emperor to some of the ministers in the court. They were used to build other estates and relieve the pain of the court's complicated affairs. The residences of the Fan clan were built halfway up the mountain. It was a good place bestowed by the previous emperor half a year before his death. The surroundings were very quiet. In front of the villa was a clear stream. The red leaves that fell from the mountain peak floated down from this clear stream. The stream was dotted with yellow flowers, and inside the villa was quiet. In this cold autumn, the shadows of wild geese were sparse in the sky, and it was indescribably lonely. After Fan Xian and his group arrived, the villa immediately became lively. Early on, the servants had tidied up the villa. Because they did not know how long the young master, mistress, and mistress planned to stay here, Fan Manor had prepared a lot of dried game. They had even sent 3 singing girls to the mountain to sing every day. Who knew how many little squirrels that had been storing food for the winter were scared away? What good place! There were servants who went to arrange the rooms. Fan Xian strolled to the front of the villa. Not far below his feet, there were clouds floating lightly. The thin mountain and green forest in the distance were particularly clear. He could not help but sigh. Lin Wanner gently leaned against his side and smiled. It really is good. When I was a child, I lived in Song Mountain for a while. It was not as quiet as your family's villa. This is our home, Fan Xian corrected. He then lovingly tied up his wife's collar. The cold air on the mountain was heavy. He was worried that she would catch a cold before her body recovered. Lin Wanner giggled and said, I know, husband. For the next few days, the young men and women passed their days in the quiet mountains. It was as if they didn't know how long the world was in peace and happiness. Fan Xian had not seen this kind of life for many days, so he seemed to enjoy it very much. Every day, if he wasn't taking Wanner along the slippery mountain path, he was standing behind his sister, watching her thin brush as she captured the beautiful scenery of the Tsang Mountains on paper. This could be considered the true married life between Lin Wanner and Fan Xian after their marriage. In this period of time, the newlyweds gradually changed from the initial love at first sight to the excitement of meeting across the wall, and then to the worry that followed. Finally, they could peacefully enjoy this thing called love. The end of the passion transformed into a delicate fragrance that lasted even longer. One morning, Lin Wanner lazily opened her eyes. She subconsciously put her fleshy arm to the side and found that there was no one beside her. She was wrapped in a warm blanket. She didn't know where her husband had gone. Lin Wanner was not surprised. Ever since they had consummated their marriage, she knew that Fan Xian would wake up very early every day. She didn't know where he went, but before she woke up, he would quietly return to his room. She had always been curious, but when she lived in Fan Manor, it was not convenient for her to do anything. Now that she was in Song Mountain, there were no elders or those annoying old nannies by her side. Lin Wanner rolled her eyes. She got up and put on a thick cloak. She put on a pair of soft shoes, and like a thief, she sneaked out the door. A gust of morning wind hit her face, and she shivered from the cold. She didn't dare tarry. She secretly smiled and went to the other main room at the end of the corridor. She knocked twice on the door. When the sleepy Fan Ro heard her voice, she quickly got up and opened the door. She was only wearing a thin layer of clothing, and she was freezing. She rubbed her hands and said, Sister-in-law, so early? After Lin Wanner arrived at Song Mountain, the little mischief that had always been hidden under her shy and cute temperament finally came out. She stuck out her tongue, hugged Ruo's waist, and pulled her into the warm quilt. She let out a very comfortable sigh. Fan Ro wasn't used to sleeping in the same bed as someone else, so she felt a little strange. But this little sister-in-law was very affectionate. She hugged Ruo and put her face next to hers. She quietly asked, Do you know what your brother does every day when it's not bright? Fan Ruo felt her sister-in-law's cold hand on her waist. She thought that if her brother saw this, he would be heartbroken. She quickly grabbed her hand to warm it. She said in a bad mood, You are a couple. Why are you asking me? Lin Wanna laughed and said, That brother of yours is always so mysterious. Let's not talk about this. Let's talk about every night when we're talking and playing chess in the room. Where does he go? Aren't you curious? Hearing her sister-in-law say this, Ruo, who had a calm temperament, couldn't help but feel a little confused. She knew that her brother practiced every morning, but these past few nights, her brother had disappeared for a period of time. She really didn't know what he was doing. In the morning, he practices martial arts. At night, I don't know. I'll ask him. Lin Wanner was curious. Practice martial arts? What kind of martial arts? Can we go take a look? Sister-in-law, you're so curious. Of course. Lin Wanner's eyes lit up like the lake in the summer villa. As a wife, it's normal to be curious about what her husband is doing. Fan Ruo realized that her sister-in-law didn't have many of the habits of the palace. In some ways, she felt that she was even more mischievous than she was. She couldn't help but laugh. It's so cold. If I were married, I'd rather sleep in my bed. If you go out now and my brother sees you and scolds you, I won't help you. Lin Wanner didn't know what Fan Xian looked like when he was angry, but she knew her husband's temperament. She grimaced. Suddenly, she smiled. If we get married? It's late autumn. It looks like my sister-in-law is beginning to feel sleepy. Perhaps it was because the bed was too warm, or perhaps it was because she was shy. But Fan Ruo's face reddened. What kind of sister-in-law are you? She reached out to tickle Lin Wanner. Lin Wanner yelped and hit back. The young sister-in-law and sister-in-law played around on the bed. In the end, Fan Ruo was no match for a married woman. Panting, she had no choice but to get out of bed. She wrapped her sister-in-law in layers of clothing. After confirming that the mountain wind couldn't reach her neck, she took her hand and left the villa to find her brother. The sky was bright, and the people in the villa were still preparing for the morning. No one noticed that the two masters had slipped out like thieves. Most of the land on the mountainside was the property of the Fan family, so no one came to disturb them. The two girls walked carefully along the path in the forest toward the mountainside. Are you sure it's this way? Fan Ruo frowned. This mountain is so big. Let's not get lost. Don't worry. Lin Wanner smiled. I have an intuition. I can feel where my husband is. Fan Ruo thought helplessly. She could only trust her unreliable intuition. Although she thought this way, she paid attention to the ground under her feet. She found that people had indeed stepped on it. This small path was so quiet. Other than her elder brother, no one else would have the interest to go into the barren mountain. After some time, the two young girls finally plucked the autumn leaves and wiped the dew off their clothes. They passed through the forest and arrived at the side of the mountain. Fortunately, Lin Wanner's body had recovered after taking Fei Jie's medicine. Otherwise, she might not have been able to make it this far. Seeing her sister-in-law's red face, Ruo felt sorry for her and wiped her face. She reminded her to fasten her cloak, which had already been unbuttoned. Only then did the two look forward. If they didn't look, they wouldn't have known. At the foot of the mountain was a gentle slope rarely seen in Tsang Mountain. Above, it was a meadow that was still green under the autumn frost. Looking up, there was a steep cliff that was more than 10 zhang high. The slope was abnormally steep, and among the rocks, there were yellow bamboos that pierced the sky like swords. There was a person on the cliff. It was Fan Xian, dressed in unlined clothing. Looking at him, he was about to jump off the cliff. Lin Wanner saw this and was indescribably shocked. She opened her mouth to cry out in alarm to stop Fan Xian. Unexpectedly, a soft and slightly cold hand covered her lips. Fan Ruo narrowed her eyes and looked at her brother on the cliff. Pretending to be calm, she said, "Don't worry." He didn't know where her confidence came from. At this time, Fan Xian had already jumped down from the cliff. His body could be seen jumping between the rocks. Each step was dangerously close to stepping on the only place where he could put his weight. As he descended, his speed became faster and faster. A few times, he almost crashed into the bamboos. But he seemed to have an innate ability to predict. He would always turn 1 or 2 turns ahead of time. He would choose a place to land, as well as the strength of the rebound, and he would brush past the bamboos. This relied on the powerful control brought by the tyrannical Jinqi in his body. It also relied on the instincts he had learned from Wuzhu. In reality, in a flash, his body was like a black light. He passed through the bamboo forest and rocks and landed steadily on the meadow. Fan Xian turned his head slightly and looked at the two girls with surprise. "Why are you here?" His breathing was not chaotic, but the bamboos on the steep slope swayed gently from his breath. Chapter 153. Lin Wanner and Fan Ruo watched the scene and couldn't help but be dumbfounded. Although the two girls knew that Fan Xian had killed an 8th-level master on Yalan Street, the thrilling scene of him rushing down the cliff was completely different from how they felt about the so-called martial way. Accuracy, calmness, and strength. These were the things that had shocked them. Even Fan Ruo, who had always trusted her brother and was much calmer than Lin Wanner, couldn't help but let out a soft cry. "Brother, how did you do that?" Fan Xian walked up from the meadow and looked at the two girls. He couldn't help but shake his head. He put his hands on the girls' heads and gently rubbed them. "It's just a daily practice." He thought to himself, If you had seen the terrifying scene of Wu Zhu jumping down the cliff outside Danzhou, you would definitely not have cared about what had just happened. He frowned. Why did you come out so early in the morning? There are beasts in the mountains. Fan Ruo looked at Lin Wanner and smiled. My wife often wakes up and doesn't see you, so she dragged me out to find you. She's curious about what you look like when you practice every day. Fan Xian looked at his wife, whose face was red from the cold. He reached out and rubbed the tip of her cold nose. Lin Wanner was not used to him being so affectionate in front of her sister. She shyly moved away. She was still immersed in the scene she had just seen. It turned out that her husband was such a powerful master. Seeming to guess what she was thinking, Fan Xian smiled and shook his head. Don't think too highly of me. Someone once said that I was above the 4th level, but not yet the 6th. Lin Wanner looked at him in disbelief. I grew up in the palace. I've seen many 7th-level masters. Husband, you're much more powerful than them. Really? Fan Xian smiled and didn't take it to heart. Instead, he said with a headache, although teacher phase medicine is very useful, the wind is strong in the mountains in the morning. What if you catch a cold running out like this? As he spoke, he tightened the scarf around her neck and said with concern, I've been used to practicing martial arts every day since I was a child. It's my fault that I didn't tell you before. Don't come out again in the future. Fan Ruo was happy to see her brother and sister-in-law so affectionate. She smiled and didn't say a word. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian turned his head and coldly said, Ruo, you too. Seeing that her brother was angry, she panicked and her eyes became misty. In a low voice, she said, Sister is wrong. In the future, I will. She was about to say that she would take good care of her sister-in-law, but Lin Wanner was also anxious to defend her. She was the one who dragged her out. Fan Xian rubbed her frozen ear and warmly said, Your sister-in-law's health is not good. How much better can your health be? If you freeze yourself, how will you get married in the future? Only now did the two young women realize that he was angry about something else. Thinking of how this young man in front of them cared for his wife and his sister, Lin Wanner and Ruo couldn't help but feel a sense of happiness. Fan Xian was actually the happiest person. His days in Song Mountain passed day by day. It seemed that he had already forgotten everything in the capital. Every once in a while, Count Sinan would send a secret letter to him, and Wang Qinian would report to him through Fan Xian's own channels. The capital was calm. The only major movement was that Yin Xiaoi, the commander of the palace who had shot Fan Xian with an arrow, had been transferred north to take up the post of commandant of the godly Will army of Xubei. Although it was only a transfer of rank, it had to be said that the emperor had given Yin Xiaoi a warning. The peace treaty between the kingdom of Qing and northern Qi had come into effect last month, so the godly Will army of Xubei was no longer of use. Although he was the commandant of the north, Yin Xiaoi couldn't do much in the current situation. He was probably very depressed. Fan Xian looked at Wang Qinian's letter and frowned slightly. Everyone knew that Yin Xiaoi's sudden rise to power was partly due to his superior 9th-level martial prowess, and partly due to the eldest princess's help. If the emperor in the palace wanted to get rid of the eldest princess, he would certainly keep Yin Xiaoi in the capital so that the Overwatch Council could keep an eye on him. In the worst-case scenario, Yin Xiaoi could be promoted to the Bureau of Military Affairs and promoted to a civil position. There was absolutely no reason for him to be transferred north to take charge of the army. Fan Xian lightly knocked on the table twice and shook his head. He understood what was going on. It seemed that the emperor still had no intention of making a move. This was only a warning to another power in the court. It seemed that the capital would be much safer. But how could a ruler who had been on the throne for more than 10 years allow someone else to safely rise? If he used the power of the emperor, the power of the Overwatch Council, and the loyalty of the Yi family, it would be very easy to kill the eldest princess and the hidden prince in one fell swoop. Fan Xian still couldn't understand this. He didn't know what the emperor was relying on to be so bold, to look at the other side so carefreely, and not to make the first move. Since he had confirmed that Jingdo was safe, Fan Xian's mood relaxed. However, he also felt a bit of regret. Starting the War of Leaflets in Jingdo was a choice he had no choice because he was not as powerful as the emperor, so he didn't dare wait. However, he had helplessly eased the situation. He and the eldest princess had a fight over the palace treasury. Originally, it was not a big deal. Later, the two sides had secretly exchanged blows a few times, and Fan Xian had always taken advantage. Given the eldest princess's personality, once she turned the tables, she would certainly not let him go. If the emperor continued to play this seemingly dangerous game, how should he deal with it? Killing the eldest princess seemed to be a very wise path, but it also involved many problems. First, could Wu Zhu guarantee that after he killed her, he would not leave any traces? This kind of brazen challenge to the dignity of the royal family was probably something that the emperor would not be able to tolerate. Second, the eldest princess was, after all, his wife's mother. If she actually died by his hand and Lin Warner found out about this, how would the husband and wife get along? After all, the death of his second brother-in-law was already like a thorn in Fan Xian's heart. Most importantly, Fan Xian and Wu Zhu did not have the confidence to kill the eldest princess. She had already returned to the fief of Xinyang, and they had no idea how many aces were there. As for the gun in his hand, Fan Xian did not dare use it. He was worried that the nobles in the capital would associate it with the deaths of the two princes and think of the name Yi Qingmei. Fan Xian glanced out the window. It was early in the morning on Tsang Mountain. Tonight, there were already light snowflakes drifting down from the sky, making the mountain manor exceptionally plain and clean. He sighed, burned the letter from his father and Wang Qinian, and then walked out. After that rainy autumn night, he had already made the decision to bury the matter of his mother in his heart until one day, when he could truly control the situation. In the middle of the corridor, a fire was lit in the central room, and it was as warm as spring. Lin Warner and Fan Ro were playing a game of mahjong with 3 singing girls sent from manor. There was an extra person on the side to help out. Fan Xian smiled as he walked in. The 3 girls hurriedly rose and bowed. The servant girl who was making the bed in the inner room also hurried out to greet the young master. Fan Xian waved his hand, indicating for them to continue. He then sat down between Fan Ro and Lin Warner. He smiled. If Xia came, I bet you would all be crying. Lin Warner smiled. We played once in the manor. I didn't lose anything. Fan Xian did not believe that with Xia's perverted and stubborn calculating abilities, he would not be able to beat his lovely wife. Fan Ruo smiled to the side. Xia did not lie. That night, Xia only won 2 strings of money from her. Fan Xian's eyes brightened. He looked at Warner. I didn't expect Warner to be so amazing. There's nothing going on in the palace all day. The ladies all like to play mahjong. Lin Warner smiled mischievously. You know, when it comes to calculating, the women in the palace are all shrewd. Naturally, it's the same when it comes to playing mahjong. I've lived in the palace for so many years, of course I'm a bit better. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. I see. The other servants in the manor were all drinking and chatting in the side courtyard. Fan Xian walked out, stepping on the snowflakes on the bluestone pavement. Behind him was the dim light, and he could hear the faint sound of mahjong tiles falling to the ground and the excited cries of girls. He suddenly remembered that Stephen Chow had a similar scene in Tang Bohu's Autumn Fragrance. But Stephen Chow was miserable, and Fan Xian was happy. That was the difference. Warner and Ro both knew that he went out every night, but after seeing the scene of him practicing martial arts that day, they obediently did not ask again. They just tacitly agreed to this fact. Walking out into the snow, Fan Xian stepped on a secret path and went straight into the depths of the bamboo forest. At the edge of the plum cliff, he stopped. This was the most secluded corner of the Tsang Mountains. Fan Xian casually stretched out his hand. Wu Zhu's hand seemed to reach out from the heavens, and he grasped Fan Xian's hand. Their hands intertwined, and Fan Xian's body swung up to the peak. The view was wide, but it was not easy for others to see that he was there. The Tsang Mountains were quiet and beautiful under the moonlight on a snowy night. Fan Xian took the cold, black metal object that Wu Zhu handed him. He lay on the ground and began to aim at the rocks in the snow. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.